recording the interview of Raymond Otto. This interview is being conducted by Ericka Carter-LaForce from the Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. Also in attendance are Deanne Otto. This interview is being recorded at Wright State University in the New Media Incubator. It is 10:32 a.m., December 16th, 2019. Hi, Ray.
Hello, good morning.
How are you feeling today?
Pretty darn good.
Fantastic. Where and when were you born?
I was born in August 19th, 1964 in Los Gatos, California, which is just outside of San Jose.
I was born in August, and I have been to Los Gatos.
The cat.
How about that?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. Who were your parents and what were their occupations?
Richard Otto, and he was a Pan American pilot and also a veteran of he was Victory 5 or Fight for the Navy in World War II, and then he was an Indiana Guardsman. And then my mom was a National Airlines flight attendant and was one of the original flight attendants that had to have nurses training, and ended up marrying my dad, and she had to give up her job because at that time you could not be married and be a flight attendant. So that's the parents.
How did they meet?
My dad got stationed at New York with Pan American, and my mom was flying the National Airlines Fly Me Mary. She was one of the chief flight attendants at the Miami base, and she would fly Miami, Fort Lauderdale, Jacksonville, Raleigh-Durham, all the way up to New York City, and then turn around and come back. And they had parties, and they met at a party, and from there on, they became friends and got married about a year later.
Okay. Fantastic. So they already enjoyed the love of flying.
Absolutely. So my dad was a Depression child, and their family farm was lost because they didn't get the pigs inoculated, and the dust storm came through, and so they had to kill all the pigs to keep the disease from spreading, and they ended up taking a farm implement and making a 16-foot trailer in it and moving all the way to Grand Coulee Dam eventually, and they lived in that for 2 years. So all three of the sons, including my dad, were enamored with aviation. And so even when he was at Grand Coulee Dam as a youngster, he was selling papers and earning money to get flying lessons or take rides. So it's sort of a disease in our family. My brother is a pilot, my cousins are pilots, and the family, except one cousin who is a veterinarian who loved animals more than airplanes, has ended up in aviation.
So do you guys question her sanity?
No, we think she's the only sane one. She lives a normal life. We all live in the big cities or move around, and so yes, we're very appreciative of that.
Why, now you're sitting here in the Air Force uniform, so I assume you joined the Air Force, and you said your dad was Navy. Why did you choose a different path than your father? I actually moved around a lot because my dad was a junior pilot. So we lived in California, New York, Connecticut, and Florida. And we eventually, because my brother was 4 years older than I am, wasn't doing as well in school, they said, well, he's moving around every year to 2 years. So we settled near our grandparents in Tampa, Florida. And the school districts in Florida were not the best in the country at the time. What?
So they put us in private school, and my brother went to Admiral Farragut Academy, and I went to Northside Christian after starting in the 4th grade, and they moved me all the way up to the 7th grade at the elementary school, a public school, and I was still getting straight A's. Then I went to the Christian school, and I was not doing well. And the one thing I do remember, and nothing against them, but it was a literal interpretation, is I was not doing well in Bible class. And so they would send me to the chapel and say, pray that you learn your verse, because you had to learn a verse a week. And I'd go in there and diligently I would pray and pray and pray and pray, and I still wouldn't learn the verse. And so I was failing in Bible study. And nuns weren't too happy with me, but I was doing well in the other subjects. and they just opened up 6th grade at Admiral Farragut, and so I was the first group of 6 of us all started the first time they offered 6th grade. And I found that military was, wear your uniform correct, pay attention to your elders, which I had to do at home already. So it seemed very comfortable for me, and it was no big change. And I really liked the instructors. The school only had our 6th grade class only had 6 students. So we got very personalized attention, and for the first year, I had to catch up. So for example, I didn't learn fractions, and I had to go to remedial. Every day they had a class session that was empty, and if you're getting B's or above, you didn't have to go to that class. But if you were getting below that, like me, in all subjects, I was going to the remedial to get caught up. And so by the second semester I was there, I was finally catching up to everyone and started getting comfortable. But it was a great place because as we grew from 6 students all the way up to, our class was the biggest in many years, was 48 students. Shockingly big at the time, but we had students from Korea, Israel, Egypt. So I grew up with people from all over the world and got to know people with a different view of the world, different accents. A lot of them were sent because our country was getting overrun, or their parents wanted them to learn English correctly so they could operate in the business environment. So they'd send them to a school where they had to dive in and survive in English. And we got the benefit of having Japanese students and Singaporeans and Korean students, and they were all part of our class. So it was a lot of fun. So that took me through high school doing Navy JROTC, which was a mode to my mom's family, which was a Navy family, and my dad's. But I liked airplanes more. And so when the opportunity came in '84, after I graduated, I joined the Air Force Reserves. And that's where I started my military career officially. And got to go to basic training at Lackland Air Force Base.
I got a few questions.
Definitely.
You jumped around a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you were in the 2nd grade, they moved you to 7th grade, and then you went back to 6th grade.
Correct. I started in 4th grade when I came down from Connecticut
to Florida.
And I went to public schools.
Uh-huh.
And because I knew all the subjects, they moved me up to the 5th grade class. And then I aced all the tests there, and they moved me up to the 6th grade class. And the highest at the elementary schools was at that school complex was 7th grade. So they put me in the 7th grade class, and I was still getting all A's and B's on the test. So I was...
How did that make you feel?
I felt very smart at first, but then I realized I was falling behind because I wasn't learning anything and I was just bored.
And so then when you got sent to this
Northside Christian,
where you weren't excelling in the Bible schools, the Bible classes, but you still could do everything else well, was your family Christian or religious in any way?
They were Christian, and they were more of a multi-faith family because they had grown up around the military and the airlines, so they were much more open-minded to accept any person. So the pastor and the nuns that ran the school were less broadened than my parents. And so when they were, I was struggling in math when I got there because I hadn't taken fractions. My English was not Southern English, so I was definitely, I remember writing a paper for social studies, and in Connecticut I got an A on it, and it was about Grant and the battles with General Lee. And I got there and I went, great, I got an A in this one. I'll take it and turn it into the Christian school, and the teacher's going to give me an A. I don't even have to review it. And I got a D on it because my facts were wrong. Because it was the War of Northern Aggression, and it wasn't, the facts that I had learned in Connecticut were not the whole truth. They were true, But there was the other side of it, which the Southerners wanted to talk about, like burning of Atlanta, which was totally unfair by their history. And the northern side was we were cutting off their railroad lines and everything else to kill the beast, because that was the industrial base of the South. And so it was an interesting, as a child growing up, moving around so much.
And I even from a school standpoint, that's got to be amazing as such a young age to be able to be forced to learn both sides, the northern side and the southern side, and then to take that into your military career. So I could see why you would have enjoyed ROTC and growing up with so many different war point views, especially growing up in a home where religion is, we love everybody, versus rules.
Yeah, very much so. So the rule number one is treat people like you like to be treated. And another great thing about my dad was I'd be studying something about India, Gandhi and the peaceful revolution. And so my dad took me to India, and I would have to do a book report for the different classes I was in. And then I would go back to school, and a year later, a student from India appeared on campus. So then I could talk to him about Buddhism and his beliefs instead of just reading it in a book. I had a real life person that I would go play intramural sports with, or just sit across the lunch table from and get to enjoy that experience.
And probably make that student feel really welcome.
Absolutely.
Now, when you say he took you to India, he just, let's get on this plane, let's go? Well,
the way the airlines work with seniority, my dad would bid trips. And so he had bid a trip to Calcutta, India. And he would take me and show me the Nigris River and show how they buried people in the river, took their drinking water from the river and used it as a sewer, because there was no septic system in the majority of the city. And you'd come home, and I can remember seeing my dad saying, "Dad, thanks for the underwear. Thank you for picking me up. Thank you. Let's get out of here. I'm so thankful. Let's go home." I'm not going to complain, because the big thing before then was all my friends were getting banana seat bicycles, and all I had was my brother's hand-me-down bicycle, and I wanted a bike like all them. And I can remember coming home that Saturday, getting on the airplane, and just getting food on the airplane was, I'm so happy to be here, and they're speaking English to me, nobody's begging, and there were so many levels of poverty that I witnessed that made me appreciate being here in America. And I think that definitely defined me, and also seeing my other friends going through school that were in perfectly good countries, but their government was overthrown or something like that, made me want to serve, as in I didn't want it to happen here.
I can completely relate to those feelings, and it's one of the reasons why I wanted to serve.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so let's get back to, now you have an older brother. Do you have any other siblings?
No, just an older brother, but we are very close to our cousins, because my uncle was a Green Beret in the Army, graduated West Point, and his two girls lived close to us because he was in and out of Vietnam, and after he got out of Vietnam, he had some definite problems with PTSD, and so it ended up my aunt and him split, and they basically landed next to us. And then my other uncle was a Navy aviator flying off the carrier, and he actually was in an accident, and so they stayed, both my cousin Bart and Krista lived near us while he was deployed to Japan, and we basically consider them like brothers and sisters because we were so close growing up. And then we have the other cousins like Lawrence Otto and all the ones that have the aviation disease, and we don't see each other much, but we all are very much closer than most families, I would say.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Do you have any nieces and nephews?
We do.
Oh.
So many nieces and nephews, too numerous to name, but they Most of them have followed with their parents and are all tied to aviation, so I see the Otto name creeping up many times when I'm looking through aviation things or trying to do something and wonder which cousin's child that is, because they're the appropriate age to be a relative.
So it's not so much as a disease as a DNA perk?
I think so. It's a vocation, because everybody in aviation doesn't do drugs. It's not allowed. We can't take the risk. And so it's an environment where people that are enjoying technology and enjoy people, you get to serve people. Because let's face it, in the airline, the only thing you're really doing is connecting people. So you have, if you work in that industry, you have to be willing to give up to connect people and treat them well. So for example, when I worked at Eastern Metro as a civilian, my job was in Atlanta Hartsfield, and we connected small airplanes to the bigger airplanes. And weather would be bad and we'd have to reroute them. Many times I would put people on a bus and say, I can get you there by bus. We'll put a flight attendant on board with drinks and meals, and we'll get you there. But by the time the weather comes up, you're probably going to be there, where if you stay here and sit in the airport, 4 hours from now, the weather may come up, we may launch and get you there, but the bus will get you there in 5 hours. So, and we would get people where they needed to go, and they would all be very happy to do that. At least we get the feedback, because you're being honest with them, and it's all about they're trying to get to somewhere where they want to be. And I think that's really what aviation's more about, is just connecting so many people so much more quickly.
Whether it's ground or air.
Yeah, it didn't, especially for those. It would be like Asheville, North Carolina would snow in very frequently, or Fort Walton Beach out of Atlanta. And that's commonly fog until 1 or 2 in the afternoon when those conditions are ripe. And so you'd just get people where they needed to go and make them happy.
A smile just does so, it just works wonders.
Absolutely, and just treating people with respect. Something that the service industry really is all about. You know, we called it the Disney factor in Florida. If you grew up in Disney, you always treated everybody nice, because that's, you know, your whole industry. We had the swamp and we had the beach and we had Disney. So everybody has to be nice to all the locals, even if they drive weird.
Okay, so let's in '84 you graduated high school. You had 4 years of Navy ROTC, and you joined the Air Force Reserves.
Correct.
What happens next?
So, slight correction. I graduated in '82.
Oh, so I apologize.
No, not at all.
Okay.
And my brother was a flight instructor at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University, and I got accepted to the Flight Leadership Fellowship Program, which was a program where, for people that were already in aviation, you would get your mechanics and your pilot's license and your engineering, and you're basically well on your way to being what I wanted to be, Chief of Maintenance and Operations at a big airline. And you know, my family was there, that's what I was going to do. So I spent, graduated in '82, and 2 weeks later I started at Embry-Riddle. And I accelerated through all my classes, was doing great, and I hit the wall. At that time, my dad had just, National and Pan Am had merged, and he had retired. And so money was tight, and I took the max amount of loans you could in 1 year and could do no more. So I ended up taking a year-long internship at Federal Express in Memphis, Tennessee, and spent my 19th to 20th year there, and was the youngest dispatcher in the United States. I got to dispatch Falcon 10s, and I thought I was the greatest thing since sliced bread. And all the neat thing about Federal Express was they never held anybody back. So they had dispatchers get pilot jobs, and they were short, and so that's how they let me do it. And they got all the FAA approvals, and I went through the test. And the FAA rule is you can't dispatch till you're age 21, and then you have to have 1 year's experience in the past 2 years. And on my 21st birthday, I went to take the test, and I had left FedEx 1 day before my 20th birthday. So I was ineligible to get my dispatcher's license. And I did not realize I could have gone to another FAA office, GATO, and asked them, and they probably would have let me take the test. It just happened to be the honorary person at Orlando wouldn't let me because of that 1 day difference. And if I had known, I would have stayed another 2 days at work and been eligible. But that definitely changed my life, because I spent the year at FedEx and returned to school and promptly ran out of money again. And then I interned at Philly International Airport Authority. And at the end of that, and coming back and running out of money, I decided I was going to enlist and took a position in the Air Force Reserves, which was great. I wanted to go in as a flight engineer, and at the time they were accepting it. And unfortunately, my sister flight at basic training in the Air Force did not fill up until January 2nd. And so we went all the way through training, and when the active duty people go into the station, they're told what their job is or where they're going if they had a guaranteed job. The two reservists, Freddie Diaz and myself, he was the house mouse and I was the dorm chief, and we went in and the reserve person had to tell us, well, got 3 options for you. You can go home, no discharge or anything, you can just go home because we have to break contract with you, or you can become a crew chief or a jet mechanic. And so both of us chose to be crew chiefs, and everybody else was happy to know where they were going. We were demoralized going, oh crud. So funny thing about basic training was that was the year they had the heavy snows in San Antonio. So we got an extra 2 weeks of basic training because of weather. And because of my prior military experience, they made me dorm chief and basically threatened me with, if anybody gets recycled or sent back, you're going with them. Everybody's going to make it. And that was my marching orders. So I brought everybody in my group through it, and I was very proud. We only lost 2 people. One person got cut when he was getting his head shaved, and it got infected with all of our PTing in the 100-degree heat. Lo and behold, 3 weeks later, we were in snow, and by wearing the wool cap, it got infected, so he had to get medically held back. And then another gentleman just couldn't perform, and he got sent back 2 weeks. But luckily, they didn't send me back, so I was very happy with that.
Did you realize later it was just a threat that they couldn't hold up?
Probably, but at the time you were
very scared.
Yes,
I know.
Very scared, and pick up the suitcase, drop the suitcase, and all that fun stuff of basic training. But it was a good group and a good timing. We were the last group that my first experience, the last group of candidates that could be put in wall lockers or hit, and they could use 4-letter words at them. So I asked permission to go use the head. And my first happening was to threaten the whole squad that was with me, was they threw me in my wall locker, and I had to stay in the wall locker and say, Raymond Otto reports his orders, sir. It's not a head, it's a latrine, over and over and over again, until I got it right, and they let me out. And 2 days later, they made me the dorm chief and basically chaperoned and made sure everybody else made it through basic. But it was funny because I'd use the Navy term for something, and I would get a 341 pulled, which was a discrepancy report. And Tech Sergeant Lloyd was my chief training instructor, and he would sit there and go, Mr. Otto, I just don't know what we're going to do with you. And he was a very good training instructor, and then Staff Sergeant Wilcott was a fresh new training instructor, and they loved to yell, but they did it in an appropriate manner, I think. So they never raised a fist. I never saw them hit anybody. But everybody knew that that threat was out there. And it was enough to curtail a bunch of people that really needed some guidance. And it worked well, because they wouldn't listen to me, wouldn't listen to other people trying to keep them out of trouble. And so we spent a lot of time marching on the quad, thanks to those individuals. And it all worked out. And a couple weeks later, we were very happy to all get on buses, and instead of going to flight engineer school, we went up to Wichita Falls at Shepherd Air Force Base, and I got to go to the mechanic school there. And of course, they didn't have spot for me, so I got to do kitchen duty for a couple weeks while the class was going to open up, and we were just starting night classes because they had so many students backlogged. And the funny part about that was that 2 weeks into my course, they had a tornado come through Wichita Falls, and like a good person, they told me, does anybody know how to use a chainsaw? And I said yes. And so they pulled me out of class, and I went around cutting down trees to make room for one car to go down a road to open up the streets again, because there was trees down everywhere over Wichita Falls. So after doing that for 2 weeks, I got brought back and was rewarded by going back on kitchen duty for another 3 weeks to wait till the next class started. And but the good side of it was that I got honor grad, and they were going to allow me to proficiency advance out. And because of my aircraft experience, they gave me a test, and I aced the written test, but on the orals and practical, they handed me a pair of pliers and said, what pliers are these? And I said, they're duckbills. No, they're long, flat-nosed pliers. That's an incorrect answer. And then they asked me what a needle-nose pliers was, and those are long, thin-tip pliers. And so I got those two wrong, and therefore I got to go through the full 7 weeks of mechanic school instead of the 3-week accelerated course. And very much enjoyed Wichita Falls, and was real excited to get out of there and go to Charleston, my first reserve station.
You said so many weeks, I can't even add that up in my head.
I basically spent 180 days on active duty when I should have only spent like 120 because of the extra weather problems and delays in training. And I missed another semester in college because I was basically went into 2 semesters instead of my plan was 1 semester, and then I would come back and start college again and go to reserve duty, and just didn't happen.
Well, you made some money, right?
I did.
They paid you. So.
It was definitely good. I thought money was very good at the time because we were living in the dorms. Interestingly, during that time at Wichita Falls, we actually lived in a hotel, I should call it a motel, just outside of base. Anybody that had family or dependents, they put on base, and so we had lots of active duty and Guard and Reserve members that had a spouse, that had a child, a new child, maybe the reason they joined the military. However, they weren't making it on their pay. So anybody that was single, we got put off base, and we got per diem to pay for the hotel. Basically, that was a break even, but it was interesting to live in the Air Force at that time when the pay was so low that members were not making it. So everybody was a member of the Airmen's Club, and we all paid so much, and that made sure that everyone got fed. So the kids got peanut butter and jellies at lunchtime or whatever food they were feeding them, but we were all part of that group, and we actually did car washes and stuff like that on our weekends once we were allowed to. Because at that time they just started, they had problems with people drinking too much. So they had what they called phases. So when we first got from basic, we had to be in our uniform the whole time, never allowed off base. 2 weeks later, during the weekends, we could wear our blues and be on base. And then 2 weeks later, we could wear our blues off base for our first liberty. And then 2 weeks later, we were allowed to wear civvies on base. And then 2 weeks after that, we were actually allowed to off-duty time after hours. We could be in civilian clothes. And slowly, and during that time, they allowed you to go to the club or whatever and ease you back into normal life. Because they had so many people go to tech school and get drunk and pass out or do stupid stuff. So I got to live through that first wave of experiment on this new phasing, which they continue today as I understand it, which I guess it worked.
Okay, so you started talking about your first duty station, and I interrupted you.
No, Charleston Air Force Base. I was a C-141 crew chief, which was a star lifter, and I was on the flight line under Chief Bowen. Great chief, reservist for many, many years, and he signed me up for the Air Force Association and took me to the first meeting. And I really enjoyed that because the Air Force Association at the time was we use no rank, everybody's a Mr. or Mrs., and doesn't matter who you are or what you are, it was there to improve everybody. So I went to the first meeting and we took off basically our ABU tops, and everybody was just in their t-shirts, and we ate lunch together and talked about what was going on, and they were great mentors. And later on I learned that, I was sitting next to majors and colonels and had no idea. They were just somebody that Chief Bowman introduced me to, and we were all talking about how we were doing better or how to do the mission. And it was the first time I'd ever heard the term three-legged stool. And it's used in the reserve and the Guard a lot, and it really means that you're like a person sitting on a three-legged stool. You have to keep your full-time boss happy to keep your job, get a retirement, get an income. You have to keep your reserve boss happy, because if you don't, you're in trouble, you get thrown in the stockade, lose your full-time job, and then you got to keep your family happy, otherwise there's no one to come home to at night. So the thing they always taught us was keep them all equally upset at you, and then you know you're doing okay. If one of them is very happy with you, look to the other two areas, because you're probably in trouble in one of them. And basically that's what I've lived under for over 34 years. Since I joined, because it really is a balance, especially when you're going to college or you're doing other activities. You had to do the extra military education. You're always ignoring your spouse or your family. You're getting distant with them because there's always some crisis or some job that you're trying to do well at work so that you keep your job, because you know you're going to impose upon them for some deployment coming up or some crisis that's happening on the reserve. So it was really neat to have somebody take you under your wing initially in your career and give you that perspective. And it really worked out well. I became Airman of the Year there, got fully trained. I volunteered to be MAC Attack, which was the Military Airlift Command. And I basically got trained on C-5s and 130s and anything that AMC had in the craft fleet. And because of my airline background, I knew a lot of those aircraft, and they would just check me out, and I could refuel a 707 or a 727 and those type aircraft. And it was to my great benefit, and also later on to my detriment. After the bombing of the Disco in Germany, President Reagan mobilized me, and I went to Torrejon Air Base in Spain. And we worked from sundown to sunup. And at the time, there was a carrier in the Gulf of Libya, and the dictator there was saying, "Across this line, you die." And we kept on pushing it because it was international waters. But that carrier was at the end of its tour, so it was low on missiles and low on equipment. And so the C-5s would fly into Spain, and we'd transload it into other aircraft, and then they would deliver it and keep them going until another carrier could arrive. And at the same time, we were moving F-16s out of Torrejon to different locations, so in case somebody struck back, we were ready to pounce on them. And so I got to see the reserves, the Navy, everybody working together. And as a young airman, because of my experience, it was funny, they put me in the line truck because I knew more aircraft than the person driving the truck. And so he worked on aircraft he was familiar with and put me in the truck to go down the line to help somebody else out, because I was more familiar with civilian aircraft. And I was just a big old buck sergeant. And here's a master's and techs working on aircraft, and I was coming to help them, and they didn't bat an eye. They were just like, "You knew the job best, tell us how to do it." And we made the mission happen, and when we were done, we'd go to the club and have breakfast, and we'd actually have dinner while everybody else was having breakfast for their 12-hour shift coming into work. And so it was a really good experience as a young airman, being in the reserves and being right there on the tip of something. They called it Operation El Dorado Canyon.
What year was that?
Let's see, that was 1985, I believe.
Wow.
Yeah, it was pretty short after I had come aboard, and it was a real, just a real experience in seeing everything worked. You know, I was working at Eastern Metro, and they came, 2 Navy guys came from Dobbins Navy base and delivered my orders, and then I proceeded to the airport and went to Charleston and got all my gear, and then they flew us commercially up to McGuire Air Force, correction, they put us on a 130 and flew us up to McGuire Air Force Base. We spent the night there and put us on a bus, and we drove to JFK Airport to the TWA terminal, and they were on strike, so we had to go through the strike line, and we had an M16 slung over our shoulder, our big green bag, and they had told us to pack in civilian bags and try not to act military. And we're going into an airport with a strike going on, and you're crossing the picket line, and these people are all going, you're bad people, and you're like, I have no choice. You know, we're going, and we walk through the strike line into the old, beautiful TWA terminal, and I remember how quiet it was when we got inside after getting through the strike lines. And they checked us in at the baggage claim area and had us walk behind, put our weapons in a case, and lock it up that we would get at the other end. And we ended up getting on the airplane. Everything went fine, great service. Landed at Madrid, Spain airport. And again, we got to customs, and unlike it is now, we got our baggage first, got our weapon, reslung it, and then went up to get our passport stamped. And there was a captain that was from McGuire Air Force Base 141s, and he was arguing with the customs person, immigration, and I got tired of waiting, and I went over to another immigration person because everybody else on the flight had cleared. And I remember him looking at my passport and everything and my orders, the NATO orders, and he said, so are you going to get any pleasure in this? I said, I'm hoping to do a little pleasure. And he said, well, I hope you have a good visit, stamp my stuff. And the rest of everybody was stuck behind the captain and getting in an argument. And I walked out of customs, and again, there was the Socialist Club all picketing, everybody coming out, and I saw a gentleman that looked military, and sure enough, he was waiting for us. And he took me outside where all the people are still picketing, and they put us on a U.S. government Bluebird blue bus in the middle of all this, and after they had told us to act incognito and everything, I got on the bus with my bags and my gun and everything with people that were basically touching the gun and stuff as we tried to work through the crowd, which just made me feel totally uncomfortable. Got on the bus, it was quiet, and the bus driver was Spanish, so I didn't get to talk to him, and I just sat there. And finally I got up and moved to the middle of the bus because so many people were walking around the bus. I didn't realize it, but there was a lead vehicle and a chase vehicle. And there was some police there with the Uzis walking around, keeping everything calm. And eventually, about 40 minutes later, I think it was, the rest of the group came out, piled on board, and we beat feet out of there to get to the base. But it was a real experience of just be polite, and what I had learned in the airlines, and the person just let me through where the captain had to be argumentative, and they just made his life rough. So I think that's where my time leading people in deployments started, because I sailed right through, had no problems, and everybody in the group was like, we're going with him. Whatever he does, we're doing. And so for the entire time we were working aircraft and working long hours, I got fully qualified on the C5 and the 130, and all the people that I had deployed with got pretty close, but they were from all over, different bases, and we learned we were selected because, again, I had more training than most people, and so why mobilize 2 or 3 people when you can get Ray? And he can, less people, and but we were very proud of it. We got back, and I got to go back to school, and we were living in Georgia at the time, so I had problems with Georgia Tech. I had left 3/4 of the way through the semester, and basically got that removed off my transcripts, and just continued on, and eventually got 200 credit hours to get a 120-hour degree from Embry-Riddle, because I went from one university to the other, just never stopped, but took that long to get all the college courses to get my degree done.
I feel you. I'm right there. I'm right there. 200 hours and still trying to get this BA. Yep.
Yes, ma'am.
I feel you. Okay.
Really.
So, how long were you in Spain?
Oh, I'm guessing about a month.
Okay, so that was just a quick.
The mission was get this happened, and they blew up the USO. What was interesting is we got deployed a week before then, and we didn't know if it was an exercise and part of our annual tour, because I was scheduled to do an annual tour and deploy with the 141 Go Forward, and instead it was no kidding for real. And I don't know if the president and the National Command Authority and everybody knew something was up and they were just getting ready for it, or it happened and we just happened to be going to Terre Haute. Don't know, but the Socialist Cub made me believe that they knew something was up, because we definitely was hostile the whole time that we were in public.
Have you ever just went back and checked history?
We did, and the history doesn't give
can't.
any real clues to whether they knew ahead of time. We knew they blew up the USO in Germany, where a lot of GIs hung out, and they blamed it on Gaddafi and pretty much tied it to the Libyan front. And that's why we retaliated against them. The 111s launched out of England, flew all the way around Spain because they didn't want to be involved, or France, and went down the Straits of Gibraltar, went over to Libya and blew up their airfield and lots of their aircraft. And came back, and one of the aircraft actually broke, got shot at, and landed in Spain. And so I went from Terre Haute to Rota Air Base, and a C-5 was down there, and it had squatted to bring the aircraft on board, but it couldn't get back up. And so I worked on it and got it to unkneel, and it took off and went back to England or wherever they were taking it, and I got put back on a little 130 and taken back to Terre Haute, Spain. So I got a day in Rota, got to see the base, and one of the funny things was that in the morning after I had fixed it, because I got there late at night, the line chief put me in a taxi and he said, "Take them for breakfast." And I went off base, and I don't really know where it was still dark. And I went to this bar and they asked me what I wanted, and I said, I would like a burrito or whatever's local. And so they brought me some type of burrito and a drink, and I said I didn't drink alcohol, so they made some concoction of orange juice and blood oranges and something else. It was delicious. It had citrus pulp in it, and I thought it was great. And I went to pay, and they said, "Oh no, you no pay. Those squids back there," and there was a bunch of sailors that were off a ship that were all drunk in the back, and they were still there at like 5 o'clock in the morning, and my bill went to them. And they would refuse to even let me leave a tip. And they put me back in the taxi, drove me back on base, and I basically picked up my toolbox and they put me on an airplane, and I came back like an hour later on that aircraft. But it was a funny experience to have grown up Navy and heard about the sailors coming off the ships and getting drunk and everything, to experience by myself in a foreign land. And I never really ever traveled overseas again and left a base when I was by myself, because I definitely felt very vulnerable. That taxi cab driver could have taken me anywhere, done anything. And with all the socialist people that were picketing at the gate, he was very gracious and steered me clear of all that and took me to a place where they took really good care of me and got me back to base, no problem. But later on I thought, boy, that was really a stupid move. But yeah, in fact, leading on, I got back from that and decided that I really didn't want that to happen again. So I went to the Georgia Guard when I got back to Dobbins, and went over and signed up with the Georgia Air Guard and became an R&R mechanic, who we do wheel and tire, rig the landing gear, and the flight controls on the aircraft. And at the time we had F-15A and Bs, where we were getting them, and they were transitioning from F-4s. So it was a great time to be there. So I left Terre Haute being the, so to speak, the expert getting in the line truck, to arriving at the Georgia Guard and getting assigned to the shop. It was great. And I was the only one that hadn't been deployed with the unit at war in the shop. and Bill Hurst and Ricky Patterson were my trainers. And the first thing Bill did is he looked at me straight in the face and he said, "I got boots older than you, and they weren't even from basic. So when we deploy, whatever I do, you're going to do. Don't question it. Ask me later, but that's what you're going to." And I thought, man, this is the greatest thing, because before I was leading, and I felt very uncomfortable not knowing what I was doing, to coming to the Guard, and they were way ahead of it. And they started me in the tool crib, wouldn't even let me touch they had thuds there and F4. And I really wanted to work on the thud before they made it into a museum bird. And they wouldn't, basically I worked 3 weekends in the tool crib, and then they gave me a speed wrench and some bits, and basically sent me out on the airplane at midday to take a big long panel off, which was like 100 screws. And I knew if I had stripped any of the screws or had a problem, that I probably wouldn't get to work on airplanes for a while. So I went out and basically really maybe even burned my hand, because the planes were painted black and dark green. I took all the screws out, properly bagged and tagged them and everything else, and the ones that were a little bit stripped, I came into the shop and said I needed to get replacement screws and paint the tops and stuff. And they said, "Oh, you don't have to do that. It's a museum bird. It's going to be repainted." And the next drill weekend when I came out, I was off of being in the tool crib and counting the tools and in the toolboxes, and I got to work. And from that point on, they trusted me and kept on giving me more and more difficult jobs, but they trained me. And it was very nice to be in a group of people. Not all the pilots, but when I first got there and they were F4s, they told me all the pilots had combat kill except one. And as they transitioned to the F-15, a lot of the pilots just couldn't take the Gs. But the tradition of the Georgia Guard at the 116th was that. It was they've been there a long time and done it, so it was nice to be in a place where you were learning and doing, where before I felt like I was on the tip and I wasn't getting supported, and these guys were, "You're not touching anything, and you're not going to mess up our toy." One of our aircraft actually had battle damage from Vietnam in it, and it had Budweiser beer cans on the inside of the panel, and they never took it off. It was good luck. And so one of the jobs that I got to do is they dropped it down and I waxed the little Budweiser beer can. And it was so smooth that there was no color on the beer can at all, but you could tell it said Budweiser, and it just, if you looked at it just the right way. But it was a tradition in that aircraft that we never took it down. And many, many years later, I got to see the film footage, because it was turned into a drone and they shot it down. Every now and then, like 2 missiles a year, they'll take missiles out of stock and they'll shoot the missiles to give the pilots the training of actually shooting a real missile. And every now and then, those shoot down the drone aircraft. And it happened to be that that aircraft got shot down when we were at a practice for Willie Tell many years later. So that was sad at the same time, but it was neat to say, I worked on that.
And now you have boots that old too, huh?
Yes, exactly. Yes, very much so. And I definitely felt that way when I do my PT tests later and later in life. The young kids would race around me and you just go, yeah, mm-hmm.
You keep going.
Yeah, exactly. That would be it. But during that time at the F-15s, we got old airplanes from Bitburg and places like that, and we'd tweak them. And that was the first time I really heard magic carpet. I think it was Ricky Patterson and I were talking, and he was saying how we really wanted to make the airplane as good as we could, so that when things went wrong, ours would work better. And so, for example, we would take the gear apart, and the standard would give us plus or minus 0.1. And brand new, it would be like 0.001. Well, even when we brought it in for that check, we would bring it back to 0.001, because if you have a little give here and a little give here in every joint, pretty soon the gear we call walk. It would have like an inch of play at the tire, which meant the plane would go down the runway swervy. Or if the wheel hit a pothole, it would make it pull one way or the other. And so by tightening it all up, making it really tight, it wouldn't do that. And so every jet that we had we always took it to the newest level. So we sort of coined it, yeah, we're making another magic carpet. Whenever they call and say, we need the airplane tomorrow, it says, hold on, we're making a magic carpet here. Give us another couple hours, we'll get it fixed. Or we'd stay late on a drill weekend. Or some of my other people that I worked with, Don Conover, or those, we would stay late after drill and get the airplane totally fixed the way we wanted to, then go home, or come in after work and work it until it was perfect. And all of us agreed that we'd return it to the fleet. And just made really good aircraft. And it was really nice that later on we'd hear from pilots and stuff that our planes were the best. And the reason is the things that we did, they noticed. And they could tell our planes were better than even newer airplanes. So that was really what it was all about as a mechanic.
I completely agree as a diesel mechanic. So let me just
Yeah. Yes.
give you the hand clap there. But my question is, did anybody have OCD? Or it was just a quality? It
was a quality thing. So we always got hand-me-downs.
Okay.
So you always hear the Marines talk about, oh, we get the hand-me-downs from the Navy. And in the Air Guard, for example, the aircraft we got at Georgia came from Bitburg, and one of them was a Hangar Queen. It had the least amount of flying hours, and et cetera, and they just couldn't keep it flying. It would always break or have a problem, and so it got ignored. And that was the airplane. If you're told, give up one of your airplanes to the Guard, who would you give? You give them your worst airplane.
Of course.
So we would send teams over, and we'd put one new engine and a new jet fuel starter. Before we'd let one of our pilots fly it back over the ocean, we'd have a good engine, something we had gone through, and we'd gone through the aircraft before we'd let it leave. And I never went on one of those trips, but I worked on the stuff that we sent to make sure that it was flying to our spec, and then our pilots felt comfortable flying over a very cold ocean, bringing it home. And we had many of aircraft come in with one engine, and that would be the engine that we had gone through. And the other engine that was on board just had a problem on the way from Gander or Iceland, and instead of stopping, the pilot would actually bring it all the way home. And several of them, if I recall, stopped at Langley or some other place that had F-15s, and we'd have to put in another engine to get it home. And then we just tear it all apart, lay it all out on the floor basically, and put it all back together, better than new. And nothing against the active duty, it was just that they didn't have the experience, like I had mentioned before, that these mechanics did. We made them our own, they were our toys, and we let the pilots borrow them. And therefore, we had a really good product, and therefore the pilots could push it more, knowing that it would hold together. And I think that's why the very best and the very worst of the Air Force is in the Guard, is because it's just the leadership and the teams that care.
All righty then.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
I learned something new today.
Good, good.
Okay.
Then I guess during that time I earned my associate's degree and from being a maintenance tech, and I was still going to school, going to local community colleges, and I got my bachelor's degree at about that time, and I had transferred got hired by Delta Airlines as the only mechanic ever not to have both his A and P, but because of my experience and the other members at the Guard unit that were working at Delta giving me recommendations, I went through that whole process and became one of the first new hire mechanics, and finished up my power plant and my avionics while I was working at Delta, and working toward getting my bachelor's degree still done. I hadn't gotten that done yet. So that was really a coup d'etat, and got to work on all sorts of airliners in heavy maintenance at Atlanta Hartsfield Airport, and then I would go to the Cobb community and go to drill at Dobbins on the Georgia Guard, and at the same time just kept on working back and forth. So that was really good. Let's see. Lo and behold, Desert Storm broke out, and we were on airplanes 3 times getting ready to deploy. Our unit was big into chemical response, so we would be one of the units that might backfill for another unit that they got snurted or possible chemical weapons were used. So we trained very hard, and so for example at Gulfport CRTC, which is a training place, we would launch the aircraft in a total chemical environment and practice. And we had old gear, so unlike the active folks that had drinking tubes in their gas masks, I did not. So the only time I drank water was when we went through the apple orchard and got decontaminated. And we did that once for just to see how well we would hold up, because they were wondering how a guard unit, whether they could hang out. And we were had a very hot day, 90-degree, high humidity, Georgia weather, and we made it. We didn't lose more than 10% of us, because if you lost more than 10% of your body weight when you went to the apple orchard, they'd pull you out of the game and put an IV in you, and if your temperature was over a certain temperature. So we did that one day during one of our training sessions down at Gulfport in Georgia, and it really made me appreciate we did it right, because we never wanted to do it for real. If somebody ever chemicals somebody or nuclear somebody, it's really just terrible on other human beings. And so I went through that, and during that time Desert Storm had kicked off, and I had a plane crash at Delta Airlines at Dallas Fort Worth. I was working at Tampa as I was the acting lead one night, and I ground the engine blades, or blended the blades that had been damaged through FOD, and replaced some leading edge flaps and slats, and checked out the aircraft and returned it to service. And later that morning it crashed near Dallas. It was coming from Arkansas, and it basically flew out of ground effect, and the pilots hadn't set the flaps for takeoff. And so they selected the gear noticed the gear was down, and thought, oh, I need to get airspeed, put the gear up. And on a 727, the big doors open when the gear open. Go to put the gear up or down, cause more drag, and the leading edge flaps weren't in position, so they went to put the flaps in the right position, and all that hydraulics couldn't move it quick enough, and so it settled into the ground, and some people got killed. So I was under the gun for possibly being a cause of the accident, and Delta was working with me in the legal department, and I got a chance to go to law school at somewhere, and they said you could go on school leave and return and you'll work in the legal department. And I thought, working through school, and I was just got my bachelor's degree done a few months earlier, and I thought, starting salary as a lawyer in the legal department, working maintenance issues that I was pretty passionate about, versus foreman is more being a lawyer. And I decided to go to law school. And 3 law schools offered the degree: Southern Methodist University, the University of Denver, and a little place called the University of North Dakota. And my dad's family was from the Dakotas. So I hopped in the car on spring break and drove up the interstate, and I got to the South Dakota border, and the interstate was blocked. Had the flashing signs out, and I went up the on-ramp to the little convenience store and said, can't close the interstate. The lady's like, you gotta get in your car, we're full up at this stop, you gotta go back 2 exits and hurry, there's a blizzard coming. And I looked up at the sky, and there were some clouds to the northwest, and sure enough, before I could get checked in, by the time I checked in and got my suitcase out of the back of my old car and was walking, I was going car to car in the snowstorm, getting to my room. And I thought, what have I done? And I ended up going to law school at the University of North Dakota because they didn't lock up their books. When I went to Southern Methodist, they had locked up the books in lockers in the library, and it was, people were stealing notes so they'd do better in law school. And at UND, the notes were out, and everybody was helping each other. And I had gone up during spring break to get an interview at Grand Forks Air Force Base on the B-1s, because the only way to get off the F-15, I was so well qualified, was to go to something that was more critical. And B-1 avionics / mechanics were more rare. And so I was going up there, and I got in late that night because of the snowstorm, was in lodging, and I woke up that next morning to a bunch of people running, calling cadence, and it was the maintenance squadron. And I went, there is no way I'm joining this unit. I am freezing already. And it turned out they'd all failed their PT test. So the squadron commander had them out there doing PT at like 5 or 6 in the morning. But I had called back to the Georgia Guard and talked to Ricky Patterson and said, I don't know if I'm joining this B1. They're out doing PT and there's snow on the ground. He says, look, they just raised the freeze for Desert Storm. He says, get down to the North Dakota Guard and get signed on there. We'll sign the transfer paperwork when you get back. But if you get signed on to a unit before they change their mind and you get locked in, because at that time I was commuting from Florida back up to Atlanta every drill weekend and stuff. So sure enough, I called the secretary at the squadron at Grand Forks and said, thank you, but no thank you, and hopped in the car, drove down to Fargo, which was about a 3-hour drive, and walked into the recruiter and said, here's who I am, I want to join, what do you got open? And I don't know which chief down at the Georgia Guard had called up to Chief Chelvick at the North Dakota Guard and said, this guy's all right, get him on board. And so they made me a dock chief on an F-16, which is where the airplanes come in, and we tear them all apart and inspect them and put them all back together and make magic carpets out of them again. And again, they had gotten old aircraft, and so we were very busy, and they were happy to see me. And so I finished the paperwork, and that night I spent the night in Fargo, and I hopped in the car with fear that they might lift the freeze and I'd be refrozen at Georgia, and drove all the way through the night back to Atlanta, and was there when the office opened in the morning, and they out-processed me and made it official. And I was out of the Georgia Guard and into law school. And that was a unique thing. And I drove back down to Tampa. And I was on leave with the airline at that time, and I was actually flying a corporate aircraft and out of Fort Pierce, Florida, and basically told them that I would be heading to law school and then I'd be leaving the job, and really packed everything up and headed up to North Dakota.
Were you still with Delta at that time?
I had left Delta just before all that transpired. I had decided to go to law school. The lawsuit in Texas had lifted, but for about 2 or 3 months I thought I might have working nights going to school. I went to work at 11 at night, got off at 7 in the morning, and usually I started class at one of the community colleges at 9 to 11. Then I'd go home and sleep, wake up and do it all over again. And I had Saturday and Sunday nights off from work, and I had Tuesday and Thursday nights off from school. And I was doing that nonstop until I was going to graduate. And so I just graduated. Prior to that, finished college, had my bachelor's degree, and so I was able to say, yeah, I think I will do law school. Because I had lost all my licenses. I had my avionics license, my A&P license, and all my pilot's licenses have good moral character. And when your plane crashed, they emergency suspended my license, which meant for me to be hired as a pilot, I needed about another 1,000 hours to be insurable for an airline. So that pretty much axed my flying career, because at the time you had to be really well qualified to get on with an airline, and I only had like 400 hours, and I'd need like 2,000, which would have been very costly.
Okay.
Yeah. So started law school, and the second day I was in the dorm, actually my wife Deanne's parents met first, and a few days later I met the beautiful young lady across the hall, and she asked me if I could put a light cover back on her cover. They had the little fluorescent light covers on the ceiling that came down, and I went across the way and met my future wife. Little did I know.
But did she know?
Probably, much more before I did.
Okay.
I definitely know that's for sure. because I grew up with all boys at Admiral Farragut and very much lived the happy days life.
Now, so you lived in a co-ed dorm? Is that?
We did. So
Okay.
I came to the school and I held out and requested the graduate dorms because I didn't want to live with a bunch of undergrads. And so I was fortunate enough that they had a room cancellation. I got to move into Hancock Hall at the University of North Dakota.
And this has got to be I'm thinking 1994?
It was 91.
Okay.
So it was 91. Yeah. And so, left there. I was in the North Dakota Guard, spent the summer working there and getting to be known by the unit and learning the aircraft, getting fully qualified so I could focus on law school because I was terrified.
Did the Guard pay for any of your schooling?
Indirectly.
Okay.
So unfortunately at the time the GI Bill did not cover anything past bachelor's degree.
Okay.
And so they never paid for any of my schooling, but the Georgia Guard repaid some of my student loans that I had gained earlier. So thankfully 2 times they paid. I spent, I think it was 4 or 5 years with the Guard. It must have been 4. And 2 of the years I got the bonus, which they doubled the bonus when it goes towards student loan repayment. So I was very happy with the Georgia Guard.
Okay.
And then in law school, the GI Bill did not cover graduate degrees. And in my last semester of law school, they did. So I got to put in a student reimbursement for my last semester in law school. But otherwise, Dee and I paid for our school and paid them all by loans and paid them off gradually and working 2nd and 3rd jobs. So on top of the Guard and Reserve, I taught college courses or aviation mechanic courses with Embry-Riddle or other universities to supplement, and our goal was to pay off our student loans, and we eventually did, thanks to that. So.
Okay. So you met Dee.
Mm-hmm.
Woo.
Yes.
And you guys, you're both first years, or is she more?
Dee came from New Jersey, and she had decided she got her undergrad in microbiology and came to the University of North Dakota and in bravery herself, stepped onto an airplane and got off at Grand Forks International Airport, where at the time baggage was basically a big piece of stainless steel. They slid the bags across, opened the garage door and just slid them through. A very small airport in the middle of northern North Dakota. And she was taking space studies. So she was like the only female student in the program and probably the only non-military person in the program, and studied geospatial satellite imagery and a bunch of neat stuff. And she was a NASA fellow. And in turn, I was a law fellow. So I studied law and survived the first year, and then approached the law professor that taught aviation law to the undergraduate pilot students at UND, and I requested to become an aviation law fellow with him, and I would teach some of the courses, the basic classes, and get more experience in aviation law, because unfortunately the aviation professors that I went to UND for had been hired by big universities that paid a lot more money for them. So by the time I was eligible to take the courses, they had moved on, and I would have to take family law, divorce law, and things like that. And I really wasn't interested, so I took technical law courses and Norwegian law. I got to intern in Norway for 1 semester, and then I took another one in Staffordshire Law School. So I spent the summers learning international law, preferably over family law and those type of things, and did 3rd-year law practitioner. Decided I basically did not want to practice law, that it was a ritual killing and it was just taking people that had a disagreement and made them enemies by the end of the legal proceedings. And so I did try the South Dakota bar and missed it by a few points, but to my great credit, I think, was that I only had 2 days off from work, and we were in the middle of Desert Shield and Desert Storm. So I was on my way to Texas for training, and my boss negotiated me showing up to a class 1 day late so I could sit for the South Dakota bar. And then later on, when we were living in Maryland, I took the Maryland bar and failed it because I didn't know the buggy whipping law, which was state law, and I hadn't studied well enough, but I had taken all the leave I could, studied my heart out, and missed it by a few points and went, law is just not for me. I wanted to complete it, get my bar passed somewhere, but I just wasn't argumentative enough and divisive enough to be a really good advocate. I was more a great advocate for things I believe in, and I went to law school to represent aviation people, and it didn't hold the interest anymore. So neat things that happened while we were there in North Dakota is I got to meet Dee. And we started as a big group going to all the football games and hockey games because they were all free to students, and it just dwindled down to her and I. And that's really another thing I think about the reserves and the Guard and what I pass along as the experience. It's really a team and a coalition in the Reserve and the Guard, much more than in active duty, because you have to impose upon your fellow workers, you have to impose upon your family, especially your spouse, and if they don't want to participate, you can't support the country, because at some point you're going to fail. There is just not enough time in your life to do all those things and stay proficient enough that you won't die when you go into combat. And your biggest fear as a reservist or a guardsman is you're going to let your partners down. These are your cohorts, and they all volunteer to give up their full-time job to go defend the country. So the worst thing you could do was always let them down and get them hurt. So everybody, in my opinion, the reason I like the Guard and Reserve has always been we just did a little bit more. We always wanted to be really good at what we did so that we all did the job and then we go home. And that's why I enjoy those people so much. So why I was at North Dakota, I was fortunate enough to get selected as an officer. They had F4s and went to F-16s, so they had a lot of WIZOs, or the weapons officer in the back seat. So they didn't hire a lot or promote from within many officers, and I got selected to be a lieutenant and went off to the Academy of Military Science at McGee-Tyson, and it was basically set up for prior enlisted folks in the Guard and Reserve, and then they opened it up for others, direct accessions or people coming off the street or active duty, to go through that training. And the training was quicker. We did it 6 days a week, and we did 8 hours of classroom a day, so we get done quicker and get back to our jobs. And great experience, once again, taught me a lot about leadership and got us in the right set of mind. And one of the neat things was getting the first salute from somebody that I worked with at North Dakota. He ended up not getting commissioned, but at the time he was one of the officer selects that would have been. And having my dad and mom come down to watch me get commissioned, since it meant a huge amount to my dad. And it was a very neat experience just to get through it. And 3 or 4 of the people that we were in our class did not make it. And just because they were stupid. We had leave one night and they were told to get back by a certain hour, and they chose not to and thought everybody would lie for them. And you were just like, why would you? And we weren't willing to put ourselves in jeopardy for somebody being that stupid. And it just proved that they didn't need to be in a leadership role. And later on, I would see that same stereotype, and it would do us well because we wouldn't trust that person and put them in those positions. And they didn't fail, and we didn't fail because they had a propensity to go out and get drunk and not be able to do what they needed to do. And the Air Force has definitely changed, where we don't have many of those folks left. But at that time, for example, when I was at Charleston, I became Airman of the Year at the wing, and I got to follow the wing commander around for a day, and he gave me a little briefcase. And the first job he had is he was going to have a meeting with the active duty to have our ORI together. The reserve unit and the active duty unit was going to have an ORI, and they were hesitating on doing it together. And he sent me to the Class 6 store, even though I was underage, to get alcohol. And I bought a bottle of Jack Daniels, and some cigars and brought it back to the meeting. And they ran out, and I went back to the Class 6 store and got more alcohol. And the funny thing was the cashier wouldn't sell it to me because I was underage. And I had him call the secretary for the commander, and he says, he's buying it for the commander, let him have it. So I was able to get the alcohol, but the military had changed. You know, at that time it was okay to drink at a meeting, and that is definitely not the military that we have now. But it greased the wheels, and the ORI did go together, and it went well, and we all passed. In fact, we won the Air Force Outstanding Unit Award because we did it jointly, and it was one of the first ones that AMC IG had seen 2 units do it combined.
You're giving out a lot of acronyms. What's an ORI?
I'm sorry, Operational Readiness Inspection.
Okay.
So the Air Force tests us. Congress said you're given money to do a job. So every 4 years you have to prove you can do it. So in the Army they do exercises and prove they can do it with the IG looking at them. The Air Force does the same thing, and we have to do our real world mission, what we're given money for, and prove we can do it. And they report that to Congress. So that was the first joint ORI, and later on we did ORIs with mixed units and stuff, and that all came, I think, from that very good leadership at Charleston that at the time said, why are we doing 2 ORIs? We got real world stuff to do. Let's go pretend we can do the real world mission together, get it over with, and we'll get back to work.
And that's what you would do in combat also. So,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, you go and fill in for the active when they're, or participate with them. That would make the most sense.
Exactly.
We have a nursing student who's a reservist, and she was like, I had to go down here, and she told me all about it, but I don't know that she used that acronym, or maybe I didn't remember. But
yes.
Yeah, it was awesome. She
Absolutely.
was like, it went well, except for she had a few words.
Yes, absolutely. And that's what it's about, is getting up to speed and making sure everybody's doing what they're supposed to do, because they don't get, when you do those large exercises, you don't fill in, you don't pretend. It's you hand the tool to that person, or if there's an injured person, the pararescueman hands it to the ASTS person, who's basically preps the person for surgery and gets them ready to put them on an airplane if they need to. Or the battle surgeons are taking them directly into surgery. All those pieces are there. So you don't pretend anything. You protect the base, you launch the airplanes, you take cover, you do everything. And that's one of the things I later did a lot of, is getting units up to that speed because they hadn't practiced, or they were out of cycle and didn't know how to operate, or they were new to their mission.
I think that's one of the things with her. She's a nursing student here, and so with her actively studying and actively doing, she was more, and she just got her E6 as an Air Force Reserve. Yeah. So we're super proud of her because she's like 23.
Absolutely.
She was, she's currently learning, she's currently doing. So she, like you, at such a young age, was, taking the lead. I don't think it was scary for her, but she also wasn't deployed to another country, right?
Absolutely.
Like she was doing it down the street in Springfield. So I'm saying that all this because I can completely relate.
Absolutely.
I know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. So that's the
pretty
thing
awesome.
I love to do, is that I can say one of the things I'm very proud of in my career is that I've only had 2 industrial accidents and 1 suicide in those 34 years when I was in charge. And the reason is because of Bill Hurst and those guys in the boots. They taught me, they said, we train hard so that when we go someplace, nobody gets hurt. And we're really hard on ourselves when we're training because we want to make sure that it's muscle memory and we do what we need to do. And you may be scared, you may not, but you're going to fall back on your training, do exactly what needs to be done, and you're going to have your best chances of walking out of there. And they survived being in their unit when it was deployed to Korea and Vietnam, and they were absolutely right. And every unit I've been in, more than a year, it's gotten the Air Force Outstanding Unit because we've done so well, and not because we just trained to do well on the test. We trained so when we went to war, we could do what we needed to do. And we really I think I was a small part of that emphasis. And it just worked. And it just kept on working every time. And I kept on getting bigger groups. from one group, they promote you and you get a little bigger group, and you're just part of a team, and everybody does what they think is right. And we, just like that reservist, you practice it until you know it so well that you know that you can do it. So for example, later on I was with the PJs, pararescuemen, and they would have to insert an IV in total darkness. So they would have to feel your veins in your arm, and we'd be practicing at Patrick, Florida, and I would be in a restroom and they would dark out all the windows, and they had just parachuted out of an airplane, landed in the water, put away their parachute properly, swam ashore, and if they didn't insert the IV on the first stick, they had to swim back out to the boat, swim back and try it again with another victim as we played. And when they got into the restroom again after swimming, they'd have to control their breath, take out their equipment, start the IV. And if they did it correctly, then the instructors that were watching would send them on. They'd have to run like a mile to the next stop. So all about training and getting comfortable and making sure you know exactly what you're doing, so when times were tough, they do what they needed to do. And I think I was a small part of that. So I guess jumping back, when I was at the North Dakota Guard, as a mechanic still going through law school, during the Christmas break I got to go down to Cornet Nighthawk, which is where the F-16s would replace the active duty or just be there, and we would intercept the drug aircraft coming out of South America from Howard Air Force Base. And I got to do that twice, and that was a huge experience in South America and learning all the corruption and different things going on. Ericka was still in power. Later on I would be involved with Operation Just Cause indirectly, but having been there and knowing the base and knowing the Navy bases that were around, and definitely getting to know the environment and what we called checkered flags at the time, which is where Guard and Reservists would know the bases that they would deploy to. And so we'd always practice scenarios with that base or spend our 2 weeks training with them. So if something did happen when we got to the base, we already knew where we were going, knew what we were doing. And I very much value that now, and I tried to do it for all my troops later on so that we were that much better when we did go to war or we were deployed. You were that much further ahead. It was just one less unknown that people had to face. And again, I just thank people for teaching me that, and I passed it along to the next group. But I guess also one of the great things is I graduated from law school. I was with the Hooligans. They made me an officer. And then shortly thereafter, they allowed me to go full-time. And while I was full-time, Dee was finishing her dissertation up at UND. So we were commuting quite the distance. And we had the '97 Fargo flood. So flood of the century. And the things I remember about it, Dee called me up and she was doing her dissertation. She was in Grand Forks. And she said, I just heard the governor of Minnesota is going to meet with the governor of North Dakota. Should I be concerned? Or some verbiage like that. And she was trying to make all the corrections on her dissertation and meet her committee and be done. And I was in Sandbag Central, and so we were taking all the sandbags, filling them and giving them to dump trucks, and they were driving them out to the small towns, villages where they had sandbagged the city and delivering new sandbags to keep them stocked because they couldn't fill sandbags where they were. And we had one trainload of 10 cars of sandbags delivered, and they had run out of ties for the sandbags, and we had put it out on the radio and asked them for 100 volunteers to help take the sandbags off, put a twist tie on them basically. It was a metal piece of wire that you'd loop around and tie the sandbag off.
You're telling me like I'm not an Army person?
I didn't think of that. So 3 military people and myself, I was put in charge. We got all the equipment and the little handles to do the sandbags. And we showed up and there was 400 volunteers at the railroad station. And quickly we organized them, and we thought we'd be there for like 4 hours, and we were done in probably 2. And probably a half hour of that was getting people to stand back let the train get in position because they were so eager to help. And it was my first real experience in a crisis or a natural disaster, and it was great. Colonel Haugen and Colonel Anvik and a bunch of others had said, Ray, he's going to go, and he needs to do this. And I didn't appreciate that until later on, that it was the perfect experience for me to realize that I could lead a coalition of people that were just, school kids, high school kids, college football players, just across the batch, train arriving at 1 a.m. in the morning, everybody's tired, and you got to keep them all from hurting themselves, get the job done, get them all on the truck, and keep it all contained. All the Red Cross people trying to feed people, the chaos and the commotion, and I just thrived in it. And we got all the bags where they needed to go, out to the little villages, and just built my experience and my confidence in leading people just when it was absolutely the right thing, right time. And again, it's all that passing it along and those people being so experienced to know somebody else had other experiences coming and they chose me to do that one because it fit what I needed. And I learned from them and continue to do that as I built new leaders. And it's really just, part of the process, but it's really neat being part of it. And it's partially a shame not to have been retired from there, because a lot of those people started there and ended there, and I didn't end my career with some of those folks, or at the Georgia Guard, or at Charleston, because I moved around. But all those people led to what we did and what all my groups did later on, because their experience led me to lead those other people or influence them to do things differently, which I think made them successful. And it's just a really neat experience to be part of that group of people.
Where did you go next?
So North Dakota, I left there. We had the blizzard. I took a job with the Air National Guard Bureau, which is in D.C. So why
Say that again?
The National Guard Bureau is who runs when...
No. Did you say anger or hanger?
Andrews Air Force
Oh,
Base.
okay,
So
sorry.
after the flood, we had lost the little house we were living in, and lots of people, the housing was very short. So I got the opportunity to be an air safety investigator and investigate airplane crashes.
Ooh.
As a lieutenant, I was being sent out on lots of crashes, and lo and behold, we had what we called the Lawn Dart series, which was, we had 9 F-16s crash, and they had lost their wings before they crashed. And what had happened, we determined failure modes, and we narrowed it down, and over the 9 mishaps, I was only a part of the last 3, but worked with some great people, and we determined that we had improved the burner section, or where the exhaust comes out, so much so that it sucked the intake side of the engine and made it log jam. So the little outer air seal got sucked in, log jammed the compressor section, and the engine would stop in 3 revolutions or so, which would cause so much torque the airplane would spin, do an aileron roll 3 or 4 times, but if the pilot tried to correct it before it had done more than 1 or 2 revolutions, it would rip the wings off of it. And so we lost several pilots while we were figuring that out. And in Arkansas, we had all the pieces to the puzzle, and I was able to figure that out. And so got lots of accolades from the safety folks, and they were very pleased, and they offered me a job, which Dee was very kind, and we moved to DC, and by that time we were actually married. One of the funny stories is I leaned on my wing commander, Colonel Hogan, and he called down to the Minneapolis Air Reserve Station, and you're not allowed to be in lodging until you're married. And he had gotten special permission for me we would go down unmarried to save on airfare. We drove from North Dakota to Minneapolis, and then we were catching the flight. We were going to get married in Maryland, where my brother lived, because all our family was on the East Coast. And we got down there, and of course we left late and everything, and we checked in, and there was a very elderly woman that worked the counter, very religious, and she was against me having a room with my wife. So she ended up putting us in the nurses' room. Instead of getting the executive colonel's suite, we got the room that all the maids and stuff gathered in before work. And so we got to sleep late. The mattress was terrible. We basically dragged the mattress onto the floor and laid there chit-chatting, finally fell asleep. And about 5 o'clock or something, the first maid came in and woke us up. What was funny about that is later on, I came back to be the wing exec of that, and I was indirectly in charge of that person. And we sort of laugh about it, but Dee and I got maybe 2 hours of sleep that night and then got on the airplane to go to Maryland to get married. And funny experience of being in North Dakota. But we ended up leaving North Dakota, put everything in a U-Haul truck and moved to Laurel, Maryland, and spent time 2 or 3 years until I could escape, because I really loved the job, but I hated Maryland. On the military side, I joined the 459th Maintenance Squadron, which was the reserve unit. Got out of the Guard because I was commuting back to North Dakota, and they were very gracious, but it was a struggle because I was doing so many investigations and so many, I couldn't keep up. Once again, it was all about a coalition or a team allowing you to serve, and I just couldn't do it. So they put me in charge of the maintenance squadron, and officially I was a section commander, and I worked on 141s. And so the 141s were the 459th, and I ran the heavy maintenance squadrons with that, and did that for like a year. During that time, I was awarded the Air Force Association's Medal of Merit for integrating the neighborhood and the community with the unit. One of the neat things on that is one drill weekend, I got to wash the wall, the Vietnam Wall. So the unit got permission, they get volunteer groups to go in, and we went real early in the morning on a drill weekend, and we got to wash the Vietnam Wall and the Korean Wall. We get spick and span. Everybody touches the wall and leaves finger residue on the wall and leaves all the gifts and mementos on the wall. And so we came in early in the morning after the National Park had already cataloged everything they had picked up on the wall, and we washed the wall with spick and span. And it was a surreal experience because it was foggy that morning, and I had known people on the wall that my uncle had known in Vietnam. So I got to wash the panel that the people's names was on. And then we went over and washed the hands in some of the parts of the Korean model where people would touch the memorial and get it all looking pretty before anybody came. And then we went back to Andrews and did our drill weekends. But that was one of the highlights that I distinctly remember that was just phenomenally unexpected. People say when you touch the Liberty Bell, it's different, and I got to do that when I interned at Philly International Airport, and thought that was of the similar experience. It was such hallowed ground. There's so much emotion or something about the Vietnam Memorial that everybody I had to badmouth and encourage some of my younger troops to volunteer. And one of the neat things is when we were on the bus coming back to the base, they thanked me because they said, they didn't expect that, and it was really a moving experience for all of us. And yeah, it was, and lo and behold, the 459th came by, and I wanted to get out of DC, and I got offered a position to go back to Minneapolis Air Reserve Station, where they knew me from the Fargo floods because Minnesota and North Dakota worked together on the floods, and they offered me the exec job at the 934th. And I'd never been an exec, and the commander said, I don't know, but we know you from the flood, and you'll figure it out. So that was the first time Dee and I got a paid move with the military, and they came and boxed up everything. It was a surreal experience. We only bought furniture for many years from IKEA because if we couldn't lift it or move it, we didn't buy it. And so it wasn't until we moved to Ohio that we actually bought real furniture. Before that, it was everything we could unbolt and put in a box that we could move ourselves. So that was a neat thing. And while I was at the 9/11, being the wing exec is when 9/11 happened. That was sort of a surreal experience. The commander's secretary came in and said, some plane hit the World Trade Center. I said, well, airplanes have hit the Empire State Building in the past, and stuff like that. And I went, okay. And I told the wing commander, and he was busy with some paperwork. And so I went down the hall and turned it on in the conference room, pulled it up on the big screen, and I saw the second plane hit the building. And I went down the hall and told him, I said, Colonel, a second airplane just hit another trade center. And he turned to me and said, get the CAT, or the Crisis Action Team, up and running. Bring the base up to full security. I want the team up. I want to shut down all of our vulnerabilities. So for example, we had an officers club that was remote. It was over near the Northwest Maintenance Complex, but it was by itself. And we closed that facility immediately and put guards out. And within the hour, we had the Minneapolis Air Reserve Station had the Minnesota Guard on it, the Marine Reserves, an Army numbered Air Force, the Navy Reserve, and everybody wanted to report for duty. And we had such a trouble because everybody was on the interstate clogging up the entrance trying to get on base, and we couldn't even get the security forces on base to help get them through the base. So we had to get out on the radio, and I was in the battle staff. And to get everybody rest, I was in charge. So I basically put out the word to the public affairs and stuff to get the word out. Reservists don't report for duty. Stay away from the base. If you've been called, please come in, but don't come to the base because you're not needed at this time. And all the planes were being grounded. Minneapolis airport was just full of airplanes everywhere. We were bringing in people. One of the neat things I did coordinate on, there was a gentleman named Captain Bill Short. He was the XP, and I was the wing exec, but we were so overloaded with active duty people and folks that needed to get back to their units that we had to prioritize. And one of the lasting memories I have is we couldn't fly airplanes, we couldn't get charter buses, everything was not available. And so thinking out of the box, we had done the coalition building, and the wing commander had just met with Jesse Ventura, the governor, and toured the base and stuff. So out of the blue, I was in the CAT, and I just picked up the phone and called the contact that I had met at the governor's office and said, here's my problem. I got special forces, I got SEALs, I've got all these people that need to get down to South Carolina and Virginia and these places, and I need 3 buses going east, and I need 2 buses going west to get all these special forces, not just General Army, General Air Force, Navy, whatever. I got special people that need to get back to where they need to go. And 2 hours later, the governor called our command post, and I answered the phone, and he said, this is Governor Ventura, and I went, yeah. And he said, no, really? And I recognized his voice, and I said, yes, sir, how may I help you? And he says, I understand you need buses. And I said, yes, sir, I've got 5 groups of special operators that need to get back to their units. They're all in the Minneapolis area. I have contacts, but I have no way of getting them. And he says, I'm on it. Within the hour, I got a call back, and he had commandeered, I don't know how he got them, but he got 2 Trailways buses, 3 Greyhound buses, and we got them scheduled, and then we got them for 5 hours later, and called all those people that had left contact information. We had a phone bank going on, and we called all those people, told them when to report, where to report. We brought them through the fence line on a gate that I had opened up and put special guards there so the people could come through, say goodbye to their families, get them on the buses, do an inventory of everybody, do everything we had to, and get them on the road. And then lo and behold, we told the governor's office that was going to happen, and we expected politicians to show up in the news and all that. And Jesse had turned all that off and made sure it was nice for the families, had sent out hot chocolate and stuff like that with the Red Cross. And by the time that 1 hour is up and we were due to send them out, police convoys of state troopers had shown up, and they did a police escort for them. And as I understand it, they had a police escort the whole way to wherever they were going. And it was set up by the governor's office. And I was so impressed by his leadership and the team at the Stadios Emergency Operations Center. And it just filled, it was the team, the coalition, everybody came together, Red Cross, everybody made it happen and worked like clockwork, and it was just an amazing experience. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Short moved on, Captain Short went to another job, and the boss said, I need you down at plans, because once again, you made deployments happen, good things happen, I need you in charge, and of making sure that we train really hard so when we go fight that we're in good shape. So moved me down to the director of plans, and we were happily, Dee and I bought a house in Richfield, which was a couple blocks from the Mall of America, and at lunchtime I could leave work, go mow the front lawn or the back lawn of the small house and go back to work without missing a beat. And so we have our weekends free to tour around and see the different things in Minnesota, and was really enjoying life. Dee got a great job, and I get this phone call, lo and behold, out of the blue, and it says, would you consider going back to Florida? And I was like, yeah, I would consider it, thinking there's an interview and everything. No, the next week I come to work and it was like, you're going to Florida, you're going to Special Ops. They're the 920th Rescue Wings, where Pararescue is stationed. They had moved up from Homestead when the hurricane destroyed Miami and Homestead. And the generals had ordered the airplanes removed from Portland's reserve unit because they had crashed a few airplanes. They moved them all to Patrick, and they needed Ray. No one else would do, and so I left on short notice, and unfortunately Dee had to sell the house, pack it all up, and move to Florida because I was under a presidential transfer.
The military didn't move you this time?
They did,
oh, okay.
But she had to sell the house, get it all ready. I didn't get to stay home, and I was that Wednesday I learned, the next Monday I was in Florida working to stand up Guardian Angel and help it. The folks down there since 9/11 had been on 11 months deployed, 1 month at home, and they were traditional reservists. They were doing really hard work. Basically so we took a squadron and built it from like 300 people up to 2,400 people. Guardian Angel weapon system was developed while we were there, just because as a team we were getting hand-me-downs from the 130s and the HH-60s, and really the combat rescue men needed their own weapon system so that the Air Force would provide them parachutes and everything when they needed them, and not just when we had spare money. And so we switched from the Air Force Combat Command to Air Force Special Ops Command, and I would go over to Herbert Field and basically advocate for the weapons system and say, here's all the things. And again, they were in total agreement. So the helicopters and 130s moved from ACC to Special Ops, and we coined the high demand, low density asset, and that allowed me to move in and out of theaters as I needed to. And it allowed, what we ended up doing is teaming people so that when one person had to stay home for somebody's birthday, the other person, if they agreed, would stay 2 weeks longer on the deployment so that family life could somehow exist with all the massive deployments. And at the same time, we, working many hours, over 80 hours a week, I helped get the pipeline started so we could get new PJs, because we didn't have the manning document to hire people. We weren't, and so all my pararescue men and crews, combat rescue officers, were all long in tooth, had been doing it a long time. And we didn't have slots for new people to come in. And Louis DiMartino, the Rug, was working in my office, a great gentleman. He basically led the charge in rescue and those folks, and I just supported him facing the bureaucracy. And we set up a better pipeline to take people, and it would take 3 years of training and 5 years of time to get somebody off the street to the time they could go into combat. And we started that because we were there pushing the bureaucracy and making everybody that needed to say yes, and it wouldn't sit on somebody's desk for 2 months because they didn't know it was important, and advocated, because we didn't have a staff at the Air Base Wing yet because we were still building one. And so I worked many late hours, and I would see Dee at Nikki's Rainbow Greek restaurant to have lunch because it was the only time we'd see each other many times. So again, I trained my folks really hard. And for example, I wrote letters to Ericka Drugs and CVS, and they allowed my folks that worked there full time to start wearing their bulletproof vests and flak vests to get used to the weight, because they would be leaving their job and 2 weeks later they would be in Afghanistan at higher altitudes, and they would get a headache from wearing more weight, flak vest, helmet, carrying their gun everywhere. And so to get them ready for it, I made them a month before start wearing their flak vest, even at work. And they all didn't want to do it, but I'd force them to do it. And lo and behold, we didn't have any incidents, and everybody got used to wearing it. And so when they got there, it was one less thing they had to worry about. And I'm very proud to say we stood up the unit and made it a wing, got congressional approval to be there, got a lot more money into the unit. I think I went from 27 million in the first year to 87 million. And that was mostly because we needed money to get people trained and equipment so they could go out the door with what they needed. But again, Dee, I was full-time at that point, so Dee suffered from me not being around much at all. She suffered through at least 2 times where I was going to deploy. Family always came last. We survived 5 hurricanes in Florida one year, and every time there was a hurricane, rescue would usually be one of the groups that would come in. So we would pre-coordinate and stage where we would position the helicopters so we could be on it. About 2 weeks before Katrina happened, we were scheduled to go visit Dee's folks in New Jersey, and I was picked to be the deployment commander and get positioned for Katrina. And I said, no, my family's coming first this time. And it was one of the few times I remember where the disaster wasn't bigger than family, because every time before that I was always Ray, he'll do anything. And somebody else would back out of it and have a birthday or something, and I would volunteer to take the deployment or work the longer hours, and Dee would suffer. And I was finally learning to take care of myself so I could take care of others.
You got that balance on that stool, huh?
And I definitely have always been the person that would sacrifice myself for my teammates. And I never got that balance. So at Katrina, the person that went was my wing commander, Colonel Tim Tarchek. And the funny story was he was at Stennis Naval Air NASA place on the coast, and it was all destroyed. And the news people came up to him and asked him how it was going, and the governor of Louisiana had not approved us going in to Katrina, so all we could do is life-saving. We could hand out water, we couldn't rescue people because the governor hadn't invited us. And unfortunately, the FEMA director of Louisiana had left to move his family, and the governor hadn't said the magic words, so that's why there was the delay at Katrina. And we were running the support cell out of Patrick because it wasn't affected. So we were flying a C-130 above New Orleans. That was a flying gas station for all of our helicopters. And out of Keesler, or where the 141s of the Mississippi Guard were, which was inland on the coast, it wasn't Keesler, it was a base further inland, they were running our helicopters. So our guys were actually sitting in the seats 10 hours a day, doing rescues and stuff like that with our gas station. But our gas station was getting gas out of Patrick, flying over there, swapping out, and we were doing all the logistics out of Patrick, flying it into the Mississippi Air Guard base to resupply our folks going into that. And it was all with my trainees. I left about 2 days into the Katrina movement, and all my trainees did exactly what they needed to do, and I was absolutely proud as punch. But before that happened, I would always be the one that had to be there because I was afraid somebody wouldn't do it correctly and somebody would get hurt or killed. So I always felt guilty, and I would always be there. And that was my big, huge learning moment. I was at George Washington's battlefield getting donuts. I love their apple cider donuts with my wife, and I was hearing about Katrina, and I had to let it go and say, hey, I'm not going to be there every time. There's going to be another disaster, another war, We had done forest fires, we've done floods, we'd done hurricanes, and I didn't have to be there for every one of them. And that was really, I think, when I graduated from being a squadron commander to more of a group commander and a strategic commander, because I had to think beyond the immediate disaster. What am I going to do 3 days later? How am I going to reconstitute all these people and make sure that they're well when they get home? And so when I got home back to Florida, and that was all going on, we had a mission coming back from CENTCOM, Afghanistan and Iraq, and they were embedded with the Army. And unfortunately, the special operators at Fort Bragg came home. 3 of them shot their spouses and then shot themselves. And I had been advocating in the wing to get more psychologists and psych nurses. We only had Denise Deathridge. God bless her, she was our psych nurse. And I was encouraging my PJs and stuff that were coming out of bad deployments to see her. And we were starting to have some drinking problems and stuff. And lo and behold, timing came perfect, unfortunately for the Army folks, but for my folks it really worked out well. And we got a psych team in, and so we got more psych nurses, and it became mandatory for guys to do a debrief. And it became mandatory for our guys while they were deployed to talk with each other, and we had mental health professionals that were at the base that were assigned, not knowing my team, but I knew that those people were deployed to the war to make sure my team was supported with all the things our pararescue were dealing with. We call them Bobs. It was somebody misses an arm and a leg, they would come to Air Force's emergency room. There were the level 1 trauma for the Army would have triages and stuff for the lightly wounded, but heavily wounded people would usually come to the Air Force triages or ERs, and they would use the PJs to come. So when they had a bad accident or a bad firefight, yes, the Army would send in maybe a medic, but we would send the PJs because they were like an EMT or a nurse anesthesiologist. They had a higher level of training than the Army medic would. So I was very proud of being part of that team once again, that we set up timing just right, the leadership putting me in the right positions. We got everybody what they needed, and again stopped bad things from happening with those families. And because of the high demand, low density, I was able to rotate them more frequently. Yeah, it's going to cost more money in airline tickets, but we kept everybody's health, and we provided the Air Force with pararescue much longer, because I definitely think those people would have just retired, because all of them had 20 years and they could have done it. And the reason they stayed in is we made it palatable for their families, and the families were great supporting them, but there's just so much you could ask for them. And by the time we left there, it was the longest I'd been in any reserve or guard unit. It was 6 years. We were ready to go, and we wanted to get out of there and be someplace with 4 seasons, and we chose Wright Pat. And
what rank were you when you left?
I was a major.
Okay.
So I left as a major, and I got a job as a straight civilian up here in the 88th LRS at base. And my reserve job, I wasn't able to get a job at the 445th here on base, so I went to the 22nd Air Force out of Dobbins again, and I was in charge of helping set up exercises, those operational readiness inspections, and more importantly, the exercises before it, to teach everybody what they're supposed to do. So many units at that time, now 5 or 6 units would come in and have to do their wartime function with squadrons from other units. So they'd have to learn how to play in a coalition like they would when they deployed. And so my job was to set up the scenarios and stuff to make sure everybody exercised all those, because I'd experienced it all and all the natural disasters and the deployments I'd been involved with and planning of them. I just planned many little disasters and many little wars, and they would come out and spend 5 days learning to do what they needed to do, their self-aid and buddy care, how to deal with a riot, whatever their UTCs demanded. So for security forces, dealing with rioters at the gate or protesters or whatever, I'd mix that all into a big script, and we'd go play that script. And then the IG would come in and do the same thing with a different script and test the unit And then when the units were struggling at 22nd, that's what I did. And I did that for about a year. And I was enjoying that, but I really wanted to get back to a unit. And fortunately, at that same time, the 910th up in Youngstown, Ohio, was looking for a deputy group commander of maintenance. And so Jane Kitchen hired me, and I got to go up there and be her deputy, and then successful commander's deputies. And we really just did the same thing as I was doing at the fighters, and we made magic carpets. Our airplanes were really used. We were the only large aircraft, so we could spray a football field with one pass. We're the only DoD agency to do it. So the 130s would actually spray bugs. So when Katrina happened, they actually sprayed the lower half of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana because they had so many dead animals and everything else. Malaria and some other things were breaking out. And they sprayed for mosquitoes, and it didn't happen because of them. And here, behold, I joined that unit, and we were making those aircrafts better. One of the missions we did was Deep Horizon. So some of our epidemiologists worked in Alaska during the oil spills, and they had discovered a way to do it, and that's why the Gulf of Mexico didn't have as much damage from that big oil spill, is because we dispersed oil dispersant that would break down the oil, and it would turn it into heavy balls that would turn into like baseball-sized balls and fall to the bottom of the ocean, or it would evaporate out. So it didn't kill the fish beds, and the Gulf of Mexico came out much more fortunate than the Gulf of Alaska because of what we learned. And we deployed people to the desert many times, and everybody did well. Like I said, one guy was working on an engine change. It was so hot, the cosmoline that they packed the engine in had dripped on the stand. He slipped and fell off of it, and that was one of our injuries. Then one of those accidental injuries. And I was like, you can't think of stuff like that. Can't, risk management that, it just happens. But to have something like that was sort of confirm that I was preparing everybody and making them think before they did stuff in an unfamiliar environment, and we had done our job. My group commanders, everybody involved, had prepared everybody so when they deployed, they didn't get hurt because they were the people that had deployed before taught them what they needed to know before they were allowed to go. And we always sent new ones with old ones and made sure that we were ready to do what we were going to do. And we did it well. One of the great things is I ended up deploying in 2012, and when I was getting there, we were pulling out of Iraq, and Youngstown was there with 3 airplanes. And General Goldfein, later to be the big general in the Air Force, was in charge at the time, and I worked for a colonel that worked for him directly. And my job was to make sure all the reservists, Air Guard and Air Reserves, and I took care of the Marine Reserves also, because they had needs and they were also reservists, and so I started helping them quite a bit when I was out there, because paperwork was wrong and their spouse wouldn't get health care or their pay was screwed up, and we'd know who to call and get it all squared away. But during that deployment, the first part was really neat, was that we were pulling out of Iraq, and the Youngstown team was there, and they were flying heavily, getting everything out. And the next group came in, and they couldn't keep up with it. And so General Goldfein says, what were those guys with the red, white, and blue tails? Damn, they were good. And it was like, that's my unit. And we had made the aircraft into magic carpets, and they performed very well, and all the crews maintained them well, and the pilots took very good care of them, didn't abuse them. And so we did our job, and it took us about 4 or 5 years to get those aircraft really worked out and in better shape than what we got them from. And another crescendo was later on after my deployment, we did a training surge, which meant we had so many new people. We flew all 9 of our aircraft very heavily for 2 weeks. And they all stayed A1, which meant when they land, there was nothing wrong with them. And the last day of the big exercise, we were going to do an elephant walk. It meant we were going to fly everything we had, and the crews, we couldn't get enough crews to fly all the airplanes, so they could only fly 8 aircraft out of the 9. But we had all 9 ready to fly. They'd flown all week, but they could only put up 8 aircraft because they only had 8 crews because one of the crews got sick. So that was my proudest moment because our airplanes, all of our toys were, all of our people had done what they needed to, and we flew many, many more hours than they should have, and we got more training in, so everybody was qualified. We got more people from other units that came to us and trained with us, qualified, because our planes flew so well. And as a maintainer, that was just, that's what we do. Magic carpet. And so a lot of people up at Youngstown call me the magic carpet man, just because we would always, whenever I go out, I'd say, don't care how long it takes to get it fixed, just fix it right, make it a magic carpet. I'll take the heat for it not being, you know, on time. We just want it, so when you turn the key, it works. We don't want to be downrange and then it breaks. Just fix it right while we got it opened up. And it was very gratifying, and all my bosses that were the group commanders or the ops group commanders were all supportive of it. So it was really a good group of people to join in.
I have a few questions.
Definitely.
Okay, so you had been sending people overseas for years, and you get to go to Iraq. What was that feeling like?
It was partially guilt that I wanted to go, because all that time I was pushing people downrange and I never stood up and I didn't take my turn. So I had over 20 years in, and I was really felt like, hey, to wear the uniform, I got to do this. And the opportunity had come up several times. I had gone to D in Florida and said, I'm going. I didn't, turned out somebody else went because I was more important to train people to get ready to go, is the way the leadership, and I accepted that. But at some point you go, I'm in the military and we've been at war. This entire time that I was in, we've been somewhere fighting in my unit, and I haven't gone. So it was scary, surreal, but it was my time. And
what did you think of it? Where did you go specifically?
So I went to LUD, so Qatar.
Okay.
And I was based out of Qatar, working at the Combined Air Operations Center, which is where centralized control of all air assets happen, and then decentralized, they do the action. So I worked out of that in the staff agency, and mine was the ARC advisor, forward ARC advisor deputy. So a full bird colonel and I would take care of all the guardsmen and air reservists that were in the CENTCOM AOR, from Kyrgyzstan all the way to Djibouti, and make sure they were getting everything they needed. And if there was a disagreement in between active duty or didn't understand something, we'd resolve the issue. So when I arrived, it was in the middle of the night. First I flew to Norfolk, Virginia, stayed on a Navy base where there was no food, had to walk like 45 minutes to get to some place that had food, got me dinner, woke up the next morning, made it to the PAX terminal, got on an airplane, flew and stopped at Ireland. And the next stop was Germany, swapped the aircrew out, then stopped in Kuwait, stayed around while they serviced the aircraft and got the bags off and everything in Kuwait. Then finally get into Qatar in the middle of the night after being on the airplane for like, who knows how long, it felt like forever.
Days.
Yes, and we were in troop status, so the seat pitch was real short, which was very tough on me. Middle of the night, and thankfully the person I was replacing met me after you cleared customs and got me something to eat, put me to bed, and I woke up, you know, like 10 hours later, which was like 12 o'clock local time, whatever it was, and got orientated and started working, trying to get as much knowledge from him as I could before he left, because he was scheduled to leave in a week and a half. And I just remember waking up, and we lived in trailer homes. So there's like 50 rooms in a long metal trailer, and we had
Hooches?
Cadillacs. Yeah, well, they were hooches.
Hooches, okay.
Yeah, but they had a single air conditioner in each room.
Right.
And a central hallway with the 1970s wood paneling. Hear your neighbor very comfortably. But I was blessed to have my own room. Being a lieutenant colonel, I got my own room, unless things got bad, which they never did. And we all shared a Cadillac, so when food poisoning, Djibouti, Qatar was a place where semi-injured people from the Army came down to recuperate. And so we would get a flu or a cold or a virus, whatever would come through the base. And I can remember the days at the Cadillac where there was buckets and you'd have to use the bucket because there were so many of us that were sick, you couldn't get to a toilet in time. And so experiences of living in the hooch. But the first night I remember waking up and knowing that the bathroom's outside and stuff, and got up, and, I'd not been in the desert yet, and I walked outside and I opened up that outer door, and 110 heat just hit me in a woof of, and I went, holy cow, I've arrived. And I had put on my uniform to get to the bathroom because I didn't know all the rules quite yet. I'd gone through when you arrive, you go through a briefing, and it's like 2 hours, and an hour and a half to get through customs and everything. So everything didn't really register. So I remember going to the bathroom, using the bathroom, and going back and looking at it and going, okay, which hooch is mine? Because there's like 10 in a row. And when I walked out of them, all I really was concerned is don't pee in your pants, get to the bathroom. And making it back to my room, and fortunately, the key worked when you checked the right door number, because you walked in the first place and all the room numbers were the same. It wasn't, you didn't remember
counting doors.
Yes, exactly.
And then T-walls.
Yes.
Third opening T-wall, fifth door down to the left.
Exactly.
This is me, I hope, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
So I loved it. It was definitely a different experience, and we were in the temporary, so we were near the bra, which was one of the 2 canopies that were shaped with a big tent pike in the top, so it looked like a brazier pointed up toward the sky, so they called it the bra. And that's where the bar was, and the eatery and the entertainment, and then the main street where all the stores were off of that.
The Air Force had a bar?
They did. So at Cutter Air Force Base, you could
fancy.
have, yes, they had 2 beers a day. You had to use a card. And so on, I can't remember what day, we had officers call with General Goldfein and all the coalition partners. And because we were in the CAOC, we were trying to get the French and the British and the Greeks and whoever was there to get along a little better. So we would go over to the officers club, which the Qatarians had made a nice club. And one night a week they would have alcohol there, and we'd have our 2 beers with the coalition partners and try and be nice to each other and get to know one another better, because there was lots of contention going on at the time on, for example, the Japanese couldn't be in combat, but they were there to help medically. And some of the other coalition partners didn't think they should be called coalition partners, and the tit for tat, and we all had to get along. At the same time, the coalition was forming, and they were trying to bring all the Arab countries, or the Persian countries, I'm not sure to say Arab Sea or the Persian Sea, depending on how you look at it, but Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain were going to sit alert for each other. Instead of every country having planes sitting on alert to go attack an Iranian aircraft that would come to attack one of those countries, they would take turns. And that was very contentious, and it was ongoing while we were there. So I can remember the Qatarians sitting alert, and I was down at UAE, and the Iranians launched 2 F-4s, and the UAE guys were just sitting there, and you're going, the horn's going off, and you're going, scramble, and they're going, well, no, they're not coming toward us, they're going toward Saudi Arabia. I said, yeah, but you're on alert. And say, oh yeah, and they go dashing off, and they were just memorized because it was the first time they'd seen a battle room with the big screen showing everything, and they had lost that. They were staying alert, so when the horn went off, it was their turn. And so I was there during that whole building of what I call a coalition, because they really hadn't been together long enough to figure out how to do it, where the British, the French, and us and Australians and New Zealanders and everybody that was in the compound, they had worked together for so many years, it just fell into place. And for example, I visited in Bagram, and I was on the boardwalk, and we had an African nation come to visit. And at that time, we were loading a bullet in our chamber, and we were standing outside the ice cream place waiting for ice cream orders to come up. And this Uganda force had joined us, and they had slung their weapons. And everybody was a little nervous because everybody else had theirs holstered or in stowed position, which meant the weapon was down at their side. And these guys were carrying them in combat load. And they hadn't been there long enough to have their equivalent rank sewn on and stuff. So I approached them and said, you know, this is a neutral area and you don't combat sling here. You're making people nervous. And this young troop, must have been like 18 or something, was the interpreter. And he was relaying it to this older gentleman who could have been a general, could have been a chief master, could have been a, you know, a gunny sergeant, but you couldn't tell because their rank translation hadn't been up there. So the gentleman translated it to him, and this guy turned around and slapped the interpreter, and apparently he had interpreted it incorrectly, what the rules were. And so this sergeant was very upset that he wasn't following the rules. And basically, it was like dealing with the French Foreign Legion. They were pretty strong on these draftees. And so he had got all of his people to decock their weapons and put their weapons the correct way that they were supposed to be on the boardwalk. And everything de-escalated. And later on, I was doing the briefings to tell the troops how they were supposed to get all their food and everything. And had one of the Great Britishers come over and go, "You were gutsy, you went up and talked to him. And thank you for doing that." We were all getting nervous. We weren't enjoying our burgers they had a TGI Fridays just down the way. And they were all nervous because, you know, their complexion made them look like they could be from the local area, and nobody was feeling comfortable until they followed the rules and everybody. But nobody had just gone up to him, and I credit my dad and stuff of just be friendly and, you know, say what you're concerned with. And that was, I think, from my airline background and everything, and it just de-escalated the whole thing in a few seconds. A little shocked at the outcome, but you know, it was good. So I went to Fob Shank, I went to Kandahar, Kabul, Kyrgyzstan was my favorite journey. So you'd leave Qatar and fly all the way down, then you'd have to take the corridor up into Pakistan up to get into Afghanistan. So you'd land and then switch aircraft to get up to Kyrgyzstan. And so it was a long day, lots of delays. And I got off the airplane with my colonel, and we were getting delivered, and it started to mist, and like heavy mist. And I had been in dust storms and everything for weeks on end. And we got off the bus, and they checked us into lodging, and we were in the lodging building next to, I went to the room, set down my bags, and went out to the picnic bench that was right outside the door. And 3 hours later, he came out, because we had to get up at 5:30 or something. And he didn't see me in the room. We had separate rooms, fortunately. And he came outside, and he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm just absorbing all the moisture." And I've been sitting out there for 2 or 3 hours, and I thought it had been like maybe 30 minutes. And I was just sucking in. There was green grass, and there was pine trees. And so I quickly went inside, switched my uniform out of my moist outfit. And what was funny is I remember going to the shave, and my ears still had sand in them. And because I was in the dew, it had turned to mud, and I looked like a native that had put mud on his face or something for mosquitoes. And got washed up, and by that time they were there, and we went to had breakfast, and I did all the briefings. So we'd normally go to one of these bases, and we would do a briefing for midnight shift as they were getting off. Then we'd do a daytime shift just as they were starting. Then we'd tour and see what the troops were doing and what their job was, and let them show off. And then we build their morale and make sure when we were doing that, we'd usually get people that would come and find out they did have problems, and we could get them fixed. And then we'd do the swing shift when they would come on duty if they had 3 shifts. They weren't just doing 2. Brief them, and then we'd be on the road again. Next stop, next day. So spent quite a bit going in and out. Unfortunately, I was at some bases that had troubles. I was in a rifle fight with only a pistol, and Army Colonel guarded one end of the dugout, I guarded the other end, and that was quite a long time until the troops came around and said we were all clear, and got to go do my morning briefings and just carried on. My lesson from that was really that deploying by yourself is something that I would never do to my troops if I could help it, because when I returned home, like my time as a crash investigator, I had learned to take mishap pilots and put them in a box and all those memories and shove them under my bed and just let it go. But when somebody's trying to kill you, your brain won't let go of that. So that subroutine was running in the back of my brain. And later on, 2 years after I came back, I went to mental health and tried to get it fixed, because Dee and I were having issues. And they basically, two captains, brand new to the military, told us it was just marital problems. I had brought my wife to the debrief to make sure there was 2 sets of ears hearing what they said, because I figured I'd forget something. And when they came out with that, Dee stomped out of there. She was having none of it. And basically, she was absolutely right. They were just not trained and just wanted to return me to duty, and there was nothing wrong with me. But I had totally blanked out those experiences. One of the other experiences is fortunately, I went up to Kuwait again, and there was a big dust storm, so I flew in commercially, and on the way back, we were doing a dignified transfer, and it was so sandy in the dust storms, the dust never settled. And I was at the air base that was at the base where they prepared the bodies to go. And I was supposed to fly back to Qatar, where the C-17 was going with the dignified transfer. But we were waiting for the dust to settle so the 130 could come up and get it. And we had to change the ice in this casket. And they were having troubles lifting the lid, so I went over and helped them out. And the thing that stuck to my mind was that it was really hot. It was still a sandy dust storm, and we were inside the hangar, but it was still dusty, and you saw the thermometer on the wall, and it was still like 100 degrees, even with the dust storm. And we're putting ice into this person's body, and usually you put them underneath the neck and down in between the legs to keep the body cool. And in this gentleman's case, they lifted open the ABUs, and there was nothing there. They had taken like a plastic milk crate or milk jug type material and made a false chest, because he had been blown up and there was nothing there, and that's why they had to open up the casket, because they had to put extra ice in it. And that just, I didn't remember that. So I just put it away, and lesson learned, just like when I got the psych teams at the 920th, I should have listened to myself and known something was wrong. But because of that it wasn't a problem, I just carried on, and Dee and I made our way and kept on going. And on the reserve side, I got promoted to colonel on the 9/10 side, so that meant I couldn't stay at the unit. And so I got a job here at Wright-Patterson. So sort of joining, I became the IMA to the commander of the installation. So my job was to total force integrate the Guard and Reserve with the active duty and take care of all the IMA or individual reservists that report to the wing.
I want to take a moment just to talk about what because you kind of sped through it, and it's very important. So one, I'd like to appreciate you so much for sharing that, because it's never easy to say those things, especially in this forum. So I can really appreciate that. And doing what I do here, and have had been in Iraq for 23 months and understanding and going through and still seeing a counselor now, I get it. It's a big deal, and spouses go through so much with us. How long were you deployed?
I was deployed a little over 6 months.
Right.
I was supposed to be there for shorter, but I ended up staying to make sure my relief was fully trained, because she ended up getting sick on arrival, and I wanted to make sure she was good.
So there you go, taking care of everybody else,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And so good for you that you've just been this amazing, electrifying leader that has just taken care of everybody. And good for you and probably Dee, who made sure that you were going to get the help so that y'all could be the best that you are, because you are an amazing couple. I can say that because I know you outside of this realm also. So let me just let everybody else know. There is this book called The Moral Injury of War. Did I tell you about it?
I have read it.
Okay, good.
Yes.
So I just want to put that out there, that it is a good book and can be helpful in this situation. And I just want to take a moment to say that counseling is never bad.
Absolutely not.
This forum is never bad. Having a conversation is never bad. And if you don't find the answer, like you said, if a captain says, oh, you're just having marital problems, BS, call it and go talk to someone else until you find an answer. So I just wanted to say that in this interview so that people listening will know.
Absolutely. And there's all sorts of good references. Once a Warrior, Always a Warrior was another book I found very good in putting it into perspective. There's another one by a Navy SEAL that reminded me of my AFSOC, or Special Operations Day, and the way they used their verbiage that hit home. But I really think one of the great things was we had Colonel Larry James, who's at Wright State University. He was the department chair in psychology. And it was my wife that knew about him and got me in. I bless him because he was a colonel, so I could relate to him. He was also at Abu Ghraib and Gitmo, and he could relate. And I would say in the first 10 minutes he had me blubbering. As he asked the question, he says, I remember specifically, he said, do you remember when you were growing up you had dreams and remember them? And I said, yeah. He says, do you remember your dreams lately? And I said, no, I don't remember dreams in a long time. And that's where he started, and he said, we don't have to relive what we did, but we're just going to move forward. But he immediately, because he knew what he was doing and stuff, I remember walking out of that first session going, I'm going to be okay, I'm not crazy. And knowing that, you know, I had put my military career, you know, I was going for, they wanted me to be a general, they wanted me to do all these things. And I just fell apart starting a new civilian job and a new military job, plus doing the extra work they wanted me to do, be general. And that subroutine of PTSD was in the background just chewing me up, causing more and more troubles in my life that I didn't realize I was emotionally reacting to things until someone pointed it out that could relate and just said, it's okay, and you're human. And you know, you got to take care of yourself first. And that what a change of the whole world.
I don't know that you said we're human. I don't know that we are. We tend to
compartmentalize.
Right, and we're trained to do so, and we do so well that we don't realize it. Right,
Absolutely.
like the dreams and stuff like that. We do it so well that we don't realize it, and we just tuck that stuff away, and it will come back out and just
bite you.
Take over us.
Mm-hmm.
So it is just super. I've got tears running down my way. I don't know why. We're all in good faith and right now having a very great conversation, but these are just things that we experience as veterans.
Absolutely.
So the takeaway here is just to make sure that we're all getting the conversations
Absolutely.
that we need.
I really think so. One of the neat things as a colonel, I got to do a lot of build the team, community, whatever you want to call it, coalition building. And one was in Richmond, Indiana. A young high school student wanted to appreciate the vets more, so they have a Christmas dinner. And I got to go over and represent the Air Force and hand out little Air Force pins to all the Air Force vets that were present. But at the same time, I went down to Warren County, and there was a gathering to welcome the Vietnam vets home. And it turned out a World War II vet showed up, and he had climbed the White Cliffs above D-Day Beach. And he was one of the few handful of people that even survived the war. Because after they climbed the cliffs, took out the guns that saved the people on the beach, they were sitting on the beach and somebody came by and said, join that unit, thinking they were just stragglers. and not that they were the sole survivors. So then they went hedgerow to hedgerow. And so he was at that Vietnam welcome home, and we're welcoming home Iraq and Afghan vets, and he started talking. And they called his wife. His wife called his children, grown children, and he was still talking about 1 o'clock. And he started talking at 10, and he told us about every person that died going up the cliff and his family and how much he respected them and everything, and it was all coming out of him. And I don't think he had ever spoke about it. He was a strong member of the Legion or the VFW in the Lebanon, and he just compartmentalized it and moved on. And I cannot imagine all the good things that have happened to me thanks to my wife and Dr. James and everybody else involved that supported me through this. I begged to get off that high pressure job, and fortunately my operational wing, the 88th Air Base wing, and specifically the 88th LRS, the good people there took me in and let me go back to a much lower grade job and work through it. And I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for that type of support. And I think of the support that the World War II and Korea and Vietnam vets had. I really think that's why the VFWs and Legions were their salvation, is because they could go someplace and they actually got help where as I understand it at the time, the VAs and other places just wanted to give them pills and didn't work through it. And I really think we are doing the right thing, getting better and better.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's finish talking about you.
Yeah, so back to, so I was a deputy group commander of the 910th Maintenance for 6.5 years. One of the happiest times. I really love making magic carpets out of those 130s and all the great people that work there. I got to deploy to Cornet Oak, which is where you go down to Muncie Air National Guard Base and go to all the embassies in South America and Gitmo. And during that time we had the Ecuadorian crisis, which is where the president held his own election. And by constitution...
Which president?
I don't remember his name.
Okay.
So by constitution in Ecuador, you can only serve 2 terms, 8 years. Then you have to leave the executive branch.
Okay.
And he held his own election, and imagine that, he won. So Congress said you have to leave, and they went to the Supreme Court justice and said, what do we do? And so they went to the military and said, kill the guy or get him out of the country. So the military went to the Chief Justice and said, what do we do? And he says, just get him out of the country. And so they basically kidnapped him and took him out. And then the Secretary of State, the US, and us were in a quandary because here we had this democracy flailing in Ecuador. So while I was down in Puerto Rico, we stood up and did much more than a normal Cornet Oak. And we had people coming in from their countries, taking their families with all the cash they could and delivering them there. And it stabilized because we were there and we flew a lot more missions. Things calmed down and they didn't think the Venezuelans were going to march over to Ecuador. And it was neat once again to see that all happening. One of the neat things that was there is we had a young troop that was about to have a baby volunteer for the deployment. And me, being the senior military member, had to explain to him that I know you're not going to be there for your child's birth, but you volunteered for this. You didn't tell your shop chief about this because somebody would have probably gone for you, but you're going to have to stay because if you go AWOL. So I had to have a counseling session with him, and he ended up staying. Everything turned out great. Baby was born. Everything went well. And things moved on, but it was one of those heartwarming moments where you go, this person must have grown 3 times in maturity overnight, because he was just like, you know, I'm going on a mission, no big deal, and I'm just going to tell him my girlfriend's going to have a baby, so I'm going to leave. And he really, you know, he just, that maturity level, he'd made it through basic and everything else, and you know, I could see in a year or 2 later, he thanked me and everything was really good. So after that, I left the 88th Air Base Wing, and like I said, I became basically the Chief of Staff for the IMA in charge of maintenance that buys all the airplanes at AFL-CMC.
Here?
Yes,
Okay.
at Wright-Patterson.
And how long have you lived here?
So I've lived here now in the same house for 13 years. Longest I've lived anywhere in my entire life, and all of that mostly in that house, an old Victorian in Waynesville, which we love very much. And so I was the director, I made the director of logistics at LCMC, and that's when on my civilian side, I became the chief of staff. And I was learning a whole new language in acquisitions, and the PTSD under that stress creeped up. And I have to thank the colonel there and some of the other people that supported me, because we didn't know what was going on. And so I went to civilian doctors, and it took 6 to 7 months to try and figure it out. And that's when Dee hooked me up with Dr. James. And like I said, I went to the first visit with him, and he knew he'd seen so many people with this. But meanwhile, things were not going well at work, and so I got to a lower grade job. I left the reserves at LCMC, and I went to Civil Air Patrol headquarters, which are the people that make sure that the Civil Air Patrol, which is all volunteers, are doing things safely, and they're doing cadet protection properly. And I did that for 2 years. And I just retired from that in April. And I very much enjoyed that, because it was like when I was a cadet in Naval Junior ROTC, and I was giving back to them. And so I got to go teach kids how to salute properly, teach them about aviation, how airfoils work, and make sure they did rescues without hurting themselves, and basically encourage them just to do well in school so they had options in the future, and stay away from drugs and bad things, things that I grew up in Florida having to do to have these choices. So it was really good. And I just woke up one morning and said, I can't do this anymore, and left, put in my retirement paperwork for the reserves, and after 34.5 years, on April 1st, I retired. And so here, a few more months later, I got to do Veterans Voices with my uncle to highlight what he did, because we did not know a lot of what he had done. And thank you for interviewing him and bringing so much to light that we didn't know about him. I decided that I should do it so that I could pass it along. And also, I like to pass along to the reservists that, you know, being part of a coalition and having their co-workers support them and sharing. So when I was deployed, I used to hold up a pillowcase that said, "Thank you, co-workers, family, and friends," because really you couldn't do that without them. And then to take care of yourself so you can do what you do, because keeping the civilian boss and coworkers happy, keeping your family happy, and supporting your nation is a balance in time. That time is the most valuable resource, and you'll never get it 100% right. You just get what you can get done as best you can with the time you have, and carry on, because it will be good enough.
Has to be.
Absolutely, and it is every time.
I completely agree. Okay, so we've talked about an awful lot.
Yes.
Do you feel like there's anything that we haven't discussed that you'd like to add to this?
I just really thankful for getting to meet Deanne and getting to marry her and share my life with her. And again, when I talk about team and coalition, I got the very good fortune of marrying my very best friend. And, you know, we share life and love, and I was a sheltered, wonderful kid thanks to my parents, and got to experience many different countries and different people, but not to share it with Dee would have made it no fun. And get to share that with all those different people. I think anybody that watches this video is that enjoy all the people you got to meet along the way, because the experience as a vet or anybody, these life experiences, I would never go back to those countries. I would never take Dee to those countries. It's a once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I never wish to repeat it.
Do you still keep in contact with some of these people?
I do. And one of the great things is we've learned through Facebook that we're doing those things. and we're staying connected as retiree groups. And we really didn't do that in the past. It's a new avenue to stay connected, and that's something that I, because of security reasons, didn't do. And now that I'm retired, I can.
Are you a part of any other veterans organizations?
I'm a lifetime member of the Air Force Association and the Reserve Officers Association and AMVETS. And the reason that is because they welcomed my uncle home from Vietnam, and some of the other clubs did not allow him because they said it was a police action. And so I've always been I became a life member to AMVETS, which I'm not active in, but I've always supported them because they took care of my family when they needed it. And then the National Guard Association of the United States, because they, again, do that mentorship, and I really like how they try and take care of the families. So one of the other things that the Guard and Reserve does is called Yellow Ribbon, and I would encourage people to do that. Unfortunately, Dee and I never were able to do it because of timing of my deployments and leadership of the command and stuff. But it lets them know of all the resources available to them and gives them a time to meet other people, more importantly than the briefings, that have been through the same thing, so the spouses can share those experiences. Because as guardsmen and reservists, we don't get to come home to an active duty base or family. We go home to our home community that has no idea where we've been and what we've done. We only go to drill weekend 1 or 2 months later and get to spend one evening talking to people that we may have deployed with about it.
So now that you're retired, after you coast through that for a while, you'll be able to mentor and be a part of the Yellow Ribbon and stuff like that, right?
Absolutely. But right now, as Dr. James has told me, I can't say yes to anything because I've always been the guy that voted, got on the village council and said yes to the Boy Scouts and everything else. And so I promised to say no and learn how to actually not do something every minute of the day.
I remember when my aunt learned to say no, and it broke my heart. I was like, but Auntie, she was like, no, I gotta say no. And I'm like, but what? Why me? Why now? I don't think this is fair. And as I approached that age when she started saying no, I can understand. So good luck with your no's.
Well, thank you.
You're very, very welcome. All right, last question. What message would you like to leave for future generations that will hear or view this message?
One group of people, one team, one nation facing the world. Everybody does a little bit, makes the world a whole lot better. So please take the time to help somebody else or do something well for somebody.
That concludes our interview with Raymond Otto. Thank you for your time today and for your military service.
Amen.